You're listening to Laugh Giraffe by Cameron Rogowski, read by the author in a single sitting. Laugh Giraffe was written in Elgin, Texas, while listening to Love on the Run by J. Ride. Chapter 1. Wow, there are so many people here, Will thought as he looked out into the audience of well over 1,000 faces. Although he had used to seeing sprawling crowds in his family's backyard, he had never experienced the sea of strangers he was now staring into. The crowd may have been bigger than normal, but it seemed a lot more calm, more stable perhaps. The chatter and movement that came with an audience of this size was conspicuously absent. Will took a deep breath and stepped out onto the small stage he had built with his father, just like he had every Saturday for the last year. Will was named after his grandpa, who preferred to go by William. Will tried to do the same up until he was 10 years old, but it's kind of hard to insist that you use your full name William when your mom continues to call you Will in public. Big William was a gas station owner who had carved out a small piece of the American dream for himself in Las Vegas by supplying everyone who came and went with the one thing they couldn't live without: gasoline. After buying a small gas station far from the strip and renovating the entire place, he began to see an increase in customers. Grandpa Williams slowly built a small empire of gas stations and convenience stores far from the glittering Las Vegas Strip. Will's parents, Bruce and Denise, had both grown up in the area. They met in the summer between their sophomore and junior year in high school when Bruce got a job at Williams' convenience store stocking shelves. Denise would come to the small corner shop to check in with her dad throughout the day, and Bruce finally got up the courage to ask her on a date after a couple of weeks. Their relationship never wavered, and they were married shortly after graduating high school. "That's just how we did things back then," is what Denise told Will every time he asked why they were nearly 10 years younger than his friend's parents. Will was born in Vegas, just like both his mom and dad. That's why it was such a shock when the family moved to Logan, Utah, a little over a year ago. Will's 12-year-old brain just couldn't figure out why they would leave everything they had, their friends, their family, their parents' jobs, to come out to what seemed like the middle of nowhere. Mom said it was because Dad found a better job. Dad had mentioned at one point that a man can only take so much time living near his in-laws. No matter the reason, Will was now in the land of sagebrush and sweeping brown mountains. Sure, both were hot, dry deserts, but his new home somehow felt like a completely different world from the southern Nevada that he wasn't quite sure he liked. "It's going to be a big change for all of us," his mom explained, as they all climbed into the moving truck before setting off to their new Utah adventure. "But we all need to be positive and make the best of it." Mom used to give Will the "I need you to be a big man for me" speech when he was younger. Once he turned 12, that little talk seemed like it would be redundant. In his mind, Will was a man, and he was trying to be strong and supportive of his parents' decision to move to Cache Valley. But he quickly found it was easier said than done. Will had spent what remained of that summer helping his mom unpack the house and playing by himself. Will laughs thinking about how scary the entire trek from Nevada to Utah had been. Now that he was 13 and had an entire year of middle school under his belt, he was able to see the move in the same adult-like way his parents did. He had grown a lot over the last year, and it was all thanks to Stretch. The quiet crowd in his backyard somehow becomes even more silent as he makes his way to the center stage. He takes the live mic from its stand. Feedback squeaks through the monitors and all through the PA system. They're still working out the kinks for the freshly installed sound system. It's only their first time using it after all. "Stretch and I have shared this stage for a while now," Will starts, addressing the audience for the first time tonight. His voice was shaky. Even though he had spoken to crowds from this very stage every weekend for nearly a year, he still felt nervous when the first words came out. "We're so happy to see you all." Will looks over at his giraffe, Stretch, who he had spent the last year working with. Will's job description is hard to pin down exactly. He's part caretaker, part babysitter, a business partner, and talent manager. Will's dad explains it best when he says, "Will does everything, including the actual comedy." Whatever the job was, it seemed like a lot to saddle on a middle schooler. At least it would if it wasn't all Will's idea in the first place. Will was the one who discovered Stretch, the one who coached him and turned him into a star. Will was the reason Stretch had traveled from their small town to the biggest stages comedy had to offer. But if you ask him, he just gave Stretch the support he needed to be the star he already was. Pretty insightful for a 13-year-old. How the two of them ended up on stage together for this very special show is about as unlikely as a 12-year-old getting to adopt a giraffe from their local zoo. Funnily enough, Will lived the dream of every animal-loving preteen and knew not to squander the opportunity. Going from adoption to Stretch to stepping on the stage was a story filled with insane amounts of luck, amazing experiences, and gut-busting laughter. And Will was excited to share every bit of that story with the audience tonight and anyone who wanted to hear it. Chapter 2. Will loved his life back in Las Vegas. He had friends who he would see on a daily basis as they ran around the suburban neighborhood and played whatever make-believe game they had started at recess earlier that day. Usually something that involved defeating aliens, using their wits and brute force. He had a crush who he'd never told anyone about and just knew he would marry her once they got old enough and graduated high school. He had favorite restaurants like Finder's Diner, Pepe's Pizza, which he pronounced Peepees, when he was younger and much more immature. And now that they had moved to Logan, he had none of that. Will decided after about a week in this new town that he just didn't belong. The saddest part is he may have been right. Logan is a small town, by most accounts, located in rural northern Utah. Although the town is small, it acts as a big city for the surrounding farming communities. People make the 20 to 45-minute drive from other, even smaller communities for common necessities. Ultimately, outside of Cache County, Logan is known for one reason: Utah State University. Within Cache County, Logan is also known for one thing: old people. Retirees who moved to Arizona to escape the snowy winters of wherever they're from quickly found that the summers in Arizona seem hot enough to nearly melt their already fragile skin. When the sun becomes too much to bear, they make the long trek to Logan, just like the pioneers who originally settled the place. No one blames the elderly for being drawn to Logan, Utah. It does seem like the entire town was built specifically for them. There are three separate stores dedicated specifically to quilting, along with countless other offerings, supplies, and the kinds of crafts that can curl the toes of any elderly woman. There's also several small diners where old men can sit at the counter and drink coffee while they tell the same tired stories and compare their grandkids' accomplishments day after day. There's even free public transit, something the younger population is grateful for because it keeps those most cataract-prone out-of-towners off the road when they could do some real damage. Yes, Logan is a bit of a wrinkly prune person paradise, but to anyone who is in any age you would call your prime, the town looks like a small watering hole packed with little culture and lots of chain restaurants. To kids, most of the world seems almost the same, but even Will could tell that this town was just missing something. He could feel that his family's self-imposed exile somehow cut him off from a culture that had become very important to him. Not to mention the fact that there was almost never anything to do. Luckily for Will, school started a week after the big move, so he wouldn't have nothing to do for long. Will never thought he would be excited to go back to school, but after spending a week cleaning and unpacking, he was dying to stop being mom's big man and actually see some people his own age. Unluckily for Will, the school was not as easy as it had been in Vegas. Not only had he moved from the center of the world to the outskirts of a state most people forgot is even on the map, he also made the move from elementary to middle school. That transition brought with it harder classes and less time to socialize. No recess. Almost no time between classes, and what little time he did have, he spent running back and forth to his locker. Maybe if he just kept all his books and supplies in his backpack all day, then he wouldn't have to use his locker. That could save him a few precious minutes each day. He had no idea what he would do with those extra minutes, but it was the first time he realized that the time which life was made up of was moving constantly. He didn't want to waste a minute trying to remember which locker was his and how to turn the combo right, left past the first number, then right again. Is this what life is going to be like from now on? Just a bunch of work and no play? Will shuddered at the thought. In an existential realization of time constantly progressing, it's not on every 12-year-old's bingo card, but Will was an exceptional child. When lunch finally came, he was relieved to have a little bit of time to socialize. Even though he had introduced himself in every class and had every classmate introduce themselves to him, he felt like they all blended together. There was only one face and name he remembered, but that's only because Russ Young's interesting fact was that he got bit by a spider over summer vacation, and now he had this big, gross, gooey hole in his leg. He even removed the bandages to show everybody. But Russ didn't really seem like the kind of guy you'd want to eat lunch with. Will stood in line silently. His gaze alternated between looking down, focusing on his shoes, and looking straight ahead, focusing on nothing at all. After nearly a third of his 45-minute lunch, he split away from the line, now with a slice of several-hour-old whole-grain pizza and a carton of suspiciously lukewarm chocolate milk. His eyes now turned from his Nikes to the open lunchroom. There were tables everywhere, but each one seemed crowded with faces he did not trust. There were tables everywhere, but each one seemed crowded with faces he not only didn't trust, but was actively intimidated by. There were older boys and girls taking selfies and videos of other kids eating their food faster than any human should. He saw several groups of kids his age, all yelling at one another and reuniting after a summer apart. He alone seemed to be the only one who had no one to sit with. Will felt a slight push on his left shoulder. "Sorry, dude," a voice came from a fast-moving skater who was just trying to squeeze by. Suddenly, Will realized he'd been standing in the doorway of the cafeteria for an embarrassing amount of time. Unsure on what to do, he quickly said, "Coming!" out loud and started walking to the back of the lunchroom as if a friend was waiting to catch up with him after their long summer. Unfortunately, he hadn't thought far enough ahead in this plan. Now that he was moving, he would need to find a place to land. He spied an open seat at a small table and sat down without even looking who was at the table. Hi?" The pretty blonde girl in the next seat over half stated, half asked. "Why are you here?" Why was he here? Originally, Will had seen the empty seat as a sanctuary from the eyes that he felt were following him across the lunchroom. Now it seemed he had simply traded one nightmare for another. He started. "I just needed a place to sit." Honesty was probably the best course of action here. The lunchroom is pretty full. "I'll tell you what," the girl started with a smile. "You can have this entire table to yourself." She and her three friends got up in unison, as if they were operating with a single mind, and left laughing quietly and looking back at Will. Now, sitting alone at his own table, sure he had made the best move he could do, but unsure whether the humiliation of the former or the latter would be worse, he ate his less than appetizing slice of limp pepperoni. Another kid sat down at the table with a thud. Will looked up to see who dared join him in sitting at the newly christened outcast table. It was a short, frustrated-looking kid. Nothing about the new lunchmate's appearance really struck Will, but one thing did strike Will almost immediately. His nostrils began to burn. "What is that?" Will asked, his face clearly showing he was referencing the smell. "Not again," the boy muttered as he grabbed his lunchbox and started to stand. "No," Will said with a lot more force than he had meant. "I mean, is that smell your lunch?" "It's okay, I'll go eat somewhere else." Will was not about to be marooned on the outcast table alone again. "It's not a bad smell," he said, half lying. "It's kimchi," the boy replied, as if that answered the question Will hadn't asked. "It kind of tastes like spicy pickle." Spicy pickle. Now that his new lunchmate had said it, he could easily place that smell. "Is it good?" Will ventured. "Yeah, I think so." "Can I try some?" "Are you sure?" Will was wondering the same thing himself. His fear of not having any friends in this social wasteland was worse than his fear of foreign foods he'd never heard of. "Yeah, can I try it?" Sure, the table mate seemed excited, more excited than Will expected. The new kid reached into his lunchbox and produced what looked like a small withering leaf with tints of orange and flecks of crimson. Will studied the leaf and held between two chopsticks and wondered if not having friends was really all that bad. You can just grab it with your fingers, the kid prompted. Will mustered up his courage and plucked the small leaf from the chopstick's clutches, took one more breath, then put the morsel in his mouth. Immediately his tongue was hit with the sour vinegar flavors that come from fermentation. Will chewed and swallowed as quickly as he could while attempting to keep a smile on his face. That was pretty good, he said, careful to sound sincere. You can have more if you want. It was a little too insincere. That's okay, he recovered. I still have to eat my pizza. Both boys looked down at the sad slice with cheese that reflected the fluorescent light of the cafeteria as if it was made of smooth finished plastic. Yum, the kid offered with clear sarcasm. So, what's your name? Will asked. Soon. Soon? Like, I'll be there soon? Yep, but I go by Sonny. Sonny, in the same timid tone Will had used when asking people to call him William, replied. I'm Will. Will wasn't his name now. He had to stick with it. Cool, Sonny said. The two boys ate their lunches in awkward silence for the rest of lunch. They were comfortable sitting together, but unsure exactly where to start a normal conversation. The warning bell rang, signaling classes were about to start again. Well, see you tomorrow, Sonny said as he packed up his lunchbox. Sounds good, said Will, excited to never relive his recent lunchroom gaffe. From that first day forward, the boys started eating lunch together every day. Will always brought a plateful of whatever pseudo-healthy lunchroom food the cafeteria had unpackaged and reheated, while Sonny brought a lunchbox filled with new and exciting flavors and smells unlike anything Will had ever experienced before. Every lunch period was like taking a short trip to another side of the world, where he would eat small bites of meat and veggies he seldom recognized with his tour guide, Sonny, who would tell him stories about what it was like growing up in Korea. That sounds fun, Will said as he chewed something Sonny called tteokbokki. So, why did you leave Korea? My dad got a job here. Mine too. My dad just started teaching Korean at the college. No way! My dad teaches at the college too! Will was excited to have another thing in common with his new friend. Over the past few weeks, they'd found a few things other than their father's occupations that tied the two together. They both liked pizza. Not the school stuff, the real stuff. Both of them wanted to be firefighters. They even lived in the same part of town. Not really within walking distance, but only a bit of a bike ride away. Maybe they work together, Sonny offered. Yeah, probably not. My dad teaches vet classes. Vet classes? Yeah, for people who want to be vets. Oh, Sonny replied, as though Will's clarification didn't help him understand it all. Will changed the subject. It's my birthday this weekend. We're going to the zoo. Have you ever been? Not to this one. Yeah, me neither. We're going this weekend. Do you want to come? Will ventured. Then, as if the offer of a day at the zoo wasn't good enough for his new friend, he added, We'll eat cake and ice cream after, too. I'll ask my mom. Not exactly the answer Will was looking for, but he understood. Nothing can happen in a 12-year-old's life without the blessing of their parents. Well, nothing their parents should ever find out about, at least. Chapter 3. Sonny's answer came the next day at lunch. He was going to be out of town visiting his uncle. That left Will alone to walk around the Logan Zoo with no one to share the experience other than his parents. And as you know, parents are not the ideal zoo companions for any freshly minted teenager. Although Will really liked hanging out with Sonny in the lunchroom, he was starting to question his choice of stopping his search for friends at just one. Logan may be a small town, but they had a pretty impressive zoo. The various enclosures held some mainstays of small town wildlife, including pheasants and white-tailed deer, but they also had more exotic fare, such as sloths, capuchin monkeys, and even a kinkajou. Will was surprised, but a bit relieved to see that, unlike most small zoos, Logan had more than common farm animals. Wow, look at that bald eagle, Will's dad exclaimed and ran up to the enclosure with the same frantic energy one would expect from a 5-year-old. Yeah, cool, Dad. Will did think the eagle was cool, but he's a teenager now. His entire job for the next 7 years is to act apathetic and give his parents a hard time. Did you know Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey to be the national bird? Mom offered. She was always good for fun factoids on family outings. Really? Will had shown interest, a very dangerous thing for a teen to do around his parents. He almost instantly regretted it. Dad turned around, his hands in his armpits, and started gobbling loudly in Will's face. Clearly, this was his attempt at contributing to the conversation with a joke. Instead of adding to the chat, the comedy killed it in its tracks. Mom rolled her eyes. Will rolled his even harder. Can I go off for a little while? Are you sure? Yeah. Will saw the look of disappointment on his mom's face. Just for a few minutes. With that, Will walked towards the Africa section of the zoo. After passing the enclosures of several different types of deer with slightly different antlers and names he had no hope of pronouncing, he came to something that made him gasp out loud. He could not contain his excitement, and, just like his dad before him, he ran up to the railing separating the animal from the small crowd. There, in front of Will's face, was a real giraffe. Will had always loved giraffes. His bedroom had them on the wallpaper when he was a little kid, and he even gave his first oral presentation in 5th grade on them. How the Logan Zoo had ended up with such an important animal was beyond him. Why would a giraffe move from Africa to Logan? Maybe the same reason he had left Vegas for the small town. A requirement from his parents. A quick glance around the enclosure told him the giraffe was alone. No family. A short examination of the giraffe also confused him. He was sure this was a giraffe, the sign on the fence said as much, but it didn't quite look like the giraffes he had seen when Googling giraffe for his elementary school report. The giraffe had a long neck, it had spots, it had a large head with small, dull horns, and long eyelashes. The legs didn't seem right, though. The creature seemed to be top half giraffe, bottom half small horse. The small legs supported the great beast, but they were less than half the size they ought to be. Once Will realized the strange features, he was unable to focus on anything else. He's pretty cool, huh? A voice came out of nowhere that made Will's heart beat faster, like when he had gotten caught staring at the prosthetic arm of his old neighbor. Yeah, what's wrong with him? Will had no time for tact. He had to figure out why this giraffe was unlike any other he'd seen in real, drawn, or digital form. The man laughed. He's born with short legs. Doctor says it's rare, but sometimes it just happens. Does it hurt him? The zoo worker shook his head no. After a short pause, the man spoke again. His name's Stretchy McNecky. Stretchy McNecky? Will couldn't hold back his laughter. Who named him that? Well, the man started, looking at the ground a little ashamed. Just then, Will's parents caught up. What's so funny there, pal? Dad asked. Check out the giraffe. Wow. Dad took a long look at the horse-like giraffe. That's really something. His name's Stretchy McNecky, said Will, laughing all over again. Why? Dad asked, looking at the zoo worker with a face showing his clear disapproval. The zoo held a community event where there was an online poll to name him. Turns out the teenagers of Logan aren't very clever when picking names, but they were determined to make it a bad one. Dad nodded, as if he understood, even though he still had no idea why the zoo decided to allow such a terrible name to be chosen. That's the problem with democracy. Irony and mayhem can be a strong motivator for some voters. Will, finally getting over the shock of seeing the giraffe's appearance and name, asked the zookeeper the question he had wondered when he first walked up to the fence. How did Stretchy get here? What, to Logan? Yeah, this seems like a pretty small zoo. How did you get a giraffe? Yeah, Dad prodded suspiciously. How exactly did a giraffe end up at the Logan Zoo? He's from Phoenix. The other giraffes wouldn't leave him alone. Eventually, they bit off his tail, and the keepers decided he had to be moved. Will hadn't even noticed the tail. There, where a typical giraffe has a small tail with a bushy tip, Stretchy had a tiny, scarred little nub covered in patchy spotted fur. Poor thing, the dad offered. Dad had always loved animals. He was the reason that Will was so fond of them. Seeing his dad's face tinged with sorrow made Will feel sad too. Old Stretchy hasn't been doing well, never really recovered from the move. Is he sick? Will asked. Just worn out, I think, the keeper replied, looking back at the giraffe. Dad can help. Oh, you can? The zoo worker asked Will's dad in a voice mostly consisting of wet sarcasm. Now that he had been put on the spot, Will's dad was unsure of what to say. He was an experienced veterinarian, but he had never worked on exotic animals like this before. I've been a vet for a while. I teach at the university now, Dad explained, giving his son's generous offer a little more context. If it'll help, I could take a quick look, he offered. The zookeeper smiled. That would be great. Can you come by tomorrow morning? Sure, Dad said. Sundays are always open, and he had always wanted to get up close and personal with a giraffe. I'll be here. Can I come? Will asked. The two men, Dad and the keeper, looked at each other, trying to decide who exactly Will was asking. I don't have a problem with it, the keeper said. Sure, Dad said. Happy birthday. Chapter 4. Sunday mornings have always been sacred in the Powell household. Not sacred in the Christian sense, but they did take a whole on the seventh day he rested very seriously. Sleeping in was more than a ritual, it was a well deserved break from the world. In Will's mind, this Sunday was a welcome exception. Will's dad did not agree. He had worked hard his entire life to earn the right to celebrate Sunday morning in his chosen form of worship. As far as he was concerned, the Sandman was canonized, and every dream was a heavenly vision. In spite of the different Sunday morning views, the two were awake, showered, and dressed by 9 a.m. They ate breakfast, Will's famous scrambled eggs. The dish wasn't really famous per se, but he had been cooking eggs for breakfast by himself since he was only 7. Will figured that 6 years of experience earned the signature dish the title famous. And why not? His hometown favorite Finder's Diner served a famous meatloaf sandwich, and the famous was on the name as soon as the dish was printed on the menu. The two walked out to Dad's truck and made the short trip across town to the Logan Zoo. As soon as they pulled into the parking lot, they saw the zookeeper, who was dressed in the same khaki outfit he had been rocking the day before. Glad you could make it, he called before Dad even cut the engine. Not a problem, Dad replied. The three of them walked into the unlocked front gate, straight past the pheasants and the kinkajou. They only stopped once they reached the enclosure marked Stretchy McNecky. Even after a night of sleep, the name seemed every bit as absurd as it had yesterday. The zookeeper unlocked the gate and let all three of them into the faux Sahara. Stretchy looked out at the three, almost completely uninterested. Most animals just look like they hold the same expression on their face at all times, but the giraffe's long eyelashes seemed to give his eyes more life. It was like he could communicate through those long black bristles. Right now he was saying a very loud and clear, whatever. Dad asked if he could see Stretchy's medical records. Course, the zookeeper said as he walked out the gate, closing it behind him. I'll be right back. Being this close to a giraffe was overwhelming. Will had never imagined he would get to touch one, and now he was so close he could ride it if he wanted. He reached out his hand to pet the animal. Will paused short of touching Stretchy's spotted coat. An introduction was probably needed before he started touching the giraffe. Hi, Stretchy, he said, assuming a high-pitched baby talk voice for some inexplicable reason. I'm Will. Will now stretched out his hand, the last couple of inches, and felt the short, rough hair on his fingers. I think he likes you, Dad said, listening to Stretchy's insides with his stethoscope. I like him too, Will said, smiling. Why don't you keep him busy while I finish the exam? Sure. Will had advanced from fingertips to complete palms, applying a bit of pressure and giving the giraffe a good solid rub along its side. He moved his hands from the side of Stretchy's torso up its neck and gave him a small pat. Will wasn't exactly sure why, but he had done the same thing to nearly every dog that he had ever pet, and they all seemed to like it. Stretchy turned his head to look directly at Will. Will smiled at him, looking into his expressive eyes. He looks pretty sad, Will said, turning to his dad. Yeah, he does, Dad agreed. He's not doing too well. The khaki-clad keeper returned with a small folder filled with papers. "Here you are," he said, handing the folder to Dad. Dad looked at the papers and shuffled them around a bit. Every page made him frown a little more concerned. He started rhythmically nodding to himself. Both Will and the keeper could feel sinking in their stomachs. "Yeah," Dad started shaking his head now. "He's in pretty rough shape. He was sent here to live out his life," said the keeper, making air quotes with his fingers. "I guess the Logan Zoo is as good as any," Dad said, looking up from the papers and closing the folder. "Not much I could do for the guy." He continued patting the side of Stretchy's front shoulder. "I figured, but since you offered, I thought I'd have you take a look." "Hey, no problem. It's a real treat to be so close to such a beautiful animal." Will knew exactly what his dad meant. Stretchy may not be beautiful in the traditional sense, but he certainly wouldn't be winning any giraffe beauty pageants or take the giraffe cheerleader to giraffe prom, but there was still something magnetic about him. All three sat in silence for a few moments. "Well, thanks," the zookeeper said, holding his hand out to Will's dad. "You got it," Dad said, taking the open hand and giving it a good shake. Will and his dad climbed back in the old pickup truck, and they started back home. The two sat in silence as they drove down Logan's Main Street, passing small shops and chain restaurants on both sides of the road. Will was looking out the window, both in awe of the experience he had just had and sad knowing that Stretchy was in such bad shape. Will felt like he had found a second friend in Logan, only to learn immediately that the new friendship was unlikely to last. Bruce had led his son through heartbreak and hardship since Will was born, but he couldn't help but realize he had never explained death to the kid. I mean, sure, he had seen movies and understood that things died, but Will had never faced death in such a real, tangible way. He shook his head as if he would throw away the dark thoughts. What was he even saying? Stretchy wasn't dead. The giraffe may be in bad shape, but he'd seen dogs who were hit by suburban moms in sedans who came out fine on the other side. Why did Stretchy have to be any different? Dad broke the lingering silence in the truck's cab. "He's pretty amazing, isn't he?" Animals were always the one way he and Will were able to bond. "He's so cool," Will said without turning his head from the window. "Yeah, he is cool." Silence ruled the rest of the ride home. Chapter 5. Mom was able to fully enjoy the Sunday morning tradition of not waking up until nature opened your eyes. She seemed chipper and fresher faced, a stark contrast to her husband and son, who came through the door looking gloomy. "Ready for lunch?" she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Both Will and his dad offered a sound somewhere between a grunt and a moan. Then they split off into their rooms. The day bled away while all three Powells spent the afternoon in solitude. Will was looking out the window of his bedroom, staring at nothing in particular. Dad was catching up on work emails, but having trouble remaining focused. Mom packed up the lunch she had prepared, cleaned the kitchen, then started on dinner. Around 5 p.m., the smell of rosemary roasted chicken filled the entire house. Neither male in the home had eaten since the famous scrambled eggs that morning. Both found themselves following the delicious scent to the kitchen, where Mom had set the table and was waiting patiently. "Ready for dinner?" she asked with the same smile that she had used earlier when inquiring about lunch. "Yes, please," Dad said. "Sure," said Will, back in teenager mode. The pals all filled up their plates and ate quietly. Dad offered several compliments to his wife throughout the dinner, remarking how moist the chicken was, and mentioning again and again how grateful he was for the home cooked meal. Craving something more substantial in the way of conversation, Mom offered up a topic. "So, how was the zoo?" Both boys looked down at their plates, each one trying to avoid eye contact, knowing the first to look was the first to answer. "That good," Mom said sarcastically. Dad mustered up the courage. "The giraffe is in rough shape, but with some care, I think he'll be fine." That's not the impression Will had gotten from seeing the examination firsthand, but Dad had always been honest with him. Hearing his dad say there was hope for Stretchy gave Will the push to speak next. "Stretchy is really cool." "He sure is," Mom replied, punctuating the point with another bite of chicken. "So," Will started, but he couldn't quite finish. "Yes, son?" "Son." Son is what Will's mom always called him when she had her guard up. The phrase had punctuated some very pivotal moments in his life, including all the biggest no's he had ever received, the most recent being when he asked if they could move back to Vegas. What if. What if we gave him some care? What do you mean, son? Stretchy, I mean. What if we adopted him? Mom's face changed from guarded curiosity to a mix of amusement and disbelief. She wasn't entirely sure how to process the question. Sure, adopting a giraffe was out of the question, but she didn't want to make Will feel bad for asking. Well, that's an interesting thought, she started. What do you think, Bruce? Uh, Bruce? Mom asked, eyeing him intently. When Dad didn't answer, Mom began to show early signs of panic. The amusement on her face now changed to fear. Bruce? It was a statement now, daring him to disagree with her. Will cut back in. He's going to be dead soon if we don't help him. That's okay, honey, Mom said. Sometimes nature takes its course, and we just have to let it happen. But we don't have to let it happen. We could save Stretchy, right, Dad? Dad continued staring at his plate, frozen, trying to calculate what situation each possible response would produce. Dad, he needs us, Will yelled, standing up from his chair. When his dad didn't meet his eyes, Will couldn't hold back the tears any longer. He ran away from the table, through the living room and upstairs. He leapt from the threshold of his room and landed face down on his bed. Will spent the next several hours crying, drying his eyes, and thinking of ways to save Stretchy. Around 9 p.m., there was a light knock at Will's door. The knock was unnecessary. The door was already open. Will turned around to see his father walk through the doorway. He sat down next to Will on the bed and took a deep breath. I talked to your mom, Dad said. He took another deep breath. We've decided that we can ask the zoo if they'll let us take care of the giraffe. Really? Dad nodded. I can use him to teach my students and give them some real world experience. He paused. Only if the zoo lets us, Will. Don't get your hopes up. Will reached out and gave his dad the biggest hug his now weak arms could muster. Dad hugged him back. Thank you, Will whispered. You're welcome, bud. Dad kissed Will's head and gave him another hug. Mom says you have to clean the kitchen from now on. I will, Will said through whimpers. Promise. Chapter 6. Absolutely not. The zookeeper's voice boomed through the warm autumn air, even though Will and his dad were alone with the khaki crusader. Both of them looked around to see if the keeper's declaration had unsettled anyone else. Silence followed. All three of them look at one another, eyes darting back and forth, each waiting for someone else to break the thickening quiet. Dad, feeling he had drawn the short straw in this staring contest, took a deep breath, then pleaded his case. The giraffe is going to waste away and die if he stays here in the enclosure. People coming to the zoo don't want to see sad, unhealthy animals. My students and I could keep a close eye on him and ensure he gets properly fed, cared for, and monitored so he could have the best chance for recovery, Dad explained, trying to keep a stern, authoritative look on his face. The silence returned, even heavier than before. From the outside, this entire situation seemed pretty ridiculous. Two men and a boy standing in the middle of the zoo arguing over the future of a deformed giraffe named Stretchy McNecky. Both men saying the giraffe would be better off with them, but not fully believing themselves. The boy looking back and forth, waiting for a resolution. Dad tried a different approach. Look, he said, I know how hard it is to care for a sick animal. You don't have the time or budget to properly nurse him back to health. I have 10 extra sets of hands in my class and funding from the department. The authoritative look Dad had been working so hard to hold now softened into worry. Please, let me help him. When Will and his dad first asked about the giraffe, the zookeeper thought it was some extravagant birthday gift from a well-to-do out-of-towner for his entitled son. The keeper now realized that Bruce was right. He couldn't care for the animal himself. There was an entire zoo full of animals under his care. The keeper felt he wouldn't be doing his duty as a conservationist if he didn't give Stretchy the best chance he could. All right, the keeper said. Thank you, Dad replied. Will couldn't help himself. He hugged the zookeeper, who was shocked and looked awkwardly at Bruce. Bruce smiled and mouthed, Sorry. Please don't make a big deal out of taking the giraffe. I don't want flack from the entire town. You let one person take home a giraffe, and pretty soon every kid who comes through here will want to take home their favorite animal, the keeper said, following the same downward spiral logic most people do after making a decision they're unsure about. I won't, Dad reassured him. The only people who will know are us, my wife, and my students. And Sonny, Will added. Both Dad and the zookeeper looked at Will, puzzled expressions covering their faces. He's my best friend. And Sonny, repeated Dad, amending the list of confidants he had just made. Sure, said the keeper. I've got a lot of work to do around here today. Can you handle it from here? Yeah, we'll get Stretchy out of your hair, Dad said, stumbling over the name Stretchy. Will? Yeah, Dad? Can we just call Stretchy Stretch? It was a small, simple change to the giraffe's name, but it did make Bruce feel a lot less childish when saying it out loud. I was thinking the same thing, Will said. Stretchy makes him sound like he's made out of bubblegum. Or like he's getting ready for an aerobics class, Dad said, trying to pile on for the joke. Only one of them thought it was funny, but it was really funny. The khaki-clad keeper walked away toward the Asia section of the zoo, leaving Will and his dad alone in front of Stretchy McNecky's enclosure. The giraffe seemed to know a major change was coming. He walked up to the fence, separating his current home from his new caretakers, and gave the pals a look of worry. They had done it. They convinced the zoo to let them take Stretch home with them. Now they just had to figure out how they were going to move him from point A to point B. Dad hadn't even considered transportation options. He figured they would be returning home, just as giraffeless as when they arrived. Now he had permission, even an obligation, to get Stretch out of this cage and to their home safely. Even though this was the preferred outcome, he never imagined they would actually have to face the problem. What now? Will asked, looking at Stretch. Stretch looked at them both with an expression that said, Yeah, dummy, what now? We could put him in the back of the truck, Dad ventured, knowing as he said it that was a bad idea. I think he'll fall out, or maybe get scared and jump out while we're driving. Yeah, I think you're right. I could walk him home, Will offered. In his head, Will imagined not so much walking Stretch home, but riding on his back, long hair, which Will didn't have, whipping in the wind along with Stretch's short mane, everyone on the street stopping to stare in awe at this master of the jungle sitting atop his faithful necky steed. Yeah, walking Stretch home was going to be awesome. I think that might be the only way to get him out of here, Dad said. Yes, Draft Writer Will, at your service. Chapter 7. Will imagined his trip home with Stretch to be reminiscent of something out of a classic Michelangelo masterpiece. Unfortunately, it was more like a Banksy. There was no long flowing hair blowing in the breeze while his shirtless, somehow Adonis-like figure was casually flexing every muscle atop the fantastic beast. There was, however, a young, out-of-proportion boy with his pubescent, constantly changing one part at a time body. The boy was using a makeshift rope leash to pull along a similarly out-of-proportion giraffe, sporting a normal top half and a bottom half seemingly hit with a shrink ray. It was quite a sight, the kind that would make Norman Rockwell go the way of Salvador Dali. The angry sun was beating down on them. Yes, it was September, but that means nothing to the weather in Logan. It must have been over 95 degrees outside, and with no wind or trees to provide shade, the town was really starting to feel like the desert it inhabited. Will was sweating and panting, even though he had only been walking at a normal pace. Stretch seemed unfazed. Stretch was born in captivity in San Diego, another desert in the great U.S. of A. After being weaned off of his mother's milk, he had been immediately shipped to the zoo in Phoenix, Arizona, another desert. Then, after he was pulled into an unfair fight and lost his tail, he was transferred up to Logan, the desert he now called home. He had never been to his native motherland, but somehow knew instinctively it was a desert, even more harsh than any of the American deserts he had lived in. Walking around in the Logan sun, he had gotten used to that. His new handler, on the other hand, seemed to be struggling with each step. Will may have been hot. He may have been drenched in his own sweat. He was more than a little embarrassed by the perplexed looks every passing pedestrian gave him, but he was still excited about bringing home his new friend. "It's going to be great, Stretch," he said in the same baby talk voice he used when speaking to animals of all sizes. "You're going to love our backyard. It's like 5 times bigger than your cage at the zoo." Stretch continued to follow his guide, responding to every small tug of the rope tied around his midsection. He had no idea what the boy was trying to tell him, but the boy's tone seemed reassuring. "You'll get to meet Sonny. He's my best friend." Will turned around to look at Stretch. "Maybe he'll let you try kimchi. That's Korean pickles." The kid looked so hopeful. Stretch gave him an encouraging look. That seemed to do the trick. Will turned around and started walking a little faster. "Maybe we could even play in the sprinklers together." Stretch just kept walking. He didn't speak English, or any other language for that matter, but he did like watching his guide's face light up with excitement. If he was going to be honest, Stretch was just happy to be out of the enclosure. The air was the same here as in the zoo, but somehow it felt more crisp as it passed through his nostrils. It was refreshing to walk more than 5 steps without having to turn around to avoid hitting a fence. After walking for nearly an hour, Stretch saw the older man that he had seen at the zoo. Bruce was standing out on the driveway, waiting for the two of them to show up. "You made it in one piece," Dad said, pretending to be surprised. "Yup, Stretch followed me. I didn't even have to use the leash," Will said, smiling. "Well, I'm happy to hear it," Dad said, taking the leash from Will. Dad led Stretch through the fence gate into their backyard. The yard was huge, bigger than any enclosure Stretch had ever been in. It was covered in green, lush grass, something a giraffe had only ever seen in the tourist exhibit that he lived next to while in Phoenix. It felt cool and soft against his tired legs and hooves. There was a white plastic fence surrounding the perimeter of the yard, broken up only by a mid-sized Utah home, which is rather large for most places in the country. In one corner of the yard, there was a large plastic bucket filled with water and another smaller bucket filled with chopped apples. "You'll be staying here," Dad said as he untied the rope from Stretch's midsection. "Will, come inside and let him get used to his new home." Will did as he was told, but continued to watch Stretch explore the backyard through his bedroom window. Stretch rushed over to one corner and began drinking. The water was cold and felt good on his hot mouth and face. After a few gulps, he stood up, using his periscope neck. Stretch surveyed his new home. Then he got the impulse to run. He quickly started galloping and slowed again before meeting the white vinyl fence on the opposite side of the lawn. Freedom! Freedom felt so good. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of Logan, Utah fill his perky ears. Day turned to night, and the long walk from the zoo to their home had worn out both Will and Stretch. Will curled up in his bed and closed his eyes, drifting off to sleep in what felt like only a few seconds. He needed the rest. The eventful weekend was over, and school was ready to accept him back into its halls the next morning. Will dreamt of what school would be like. What would it be like if he took Stretch to show and tell? Well, not show and tell, that was for elementary kids. What if he brought Stretch to middle school equivalent? A talent show, maybe. Is having a giraffe a talent? He awoke suddenly with a deep inhale. That sound. What was that? There was a soft, deep hum coming from outside. He crept to the window and opened the blinds to see Stretch's huge face, a worried look in his eyes. Will unlocked the window and slid it open. "Stretch, what are you doing? You're supposed to be sleeping." Stretch continued to make the guttural hum. "Fine, I'm coming." He may have acted like an annoyed parent who had to comfort their child post-nightmare, but in reality he was excited to spend more time with Stretch. He rushed downstairs in his pajama pants and Ninja Turtles t-shirt, carrying the quilt his grandma had made him last Christmas. "We need to sleep, though," Will said, just as much to himself as Stretch. Stretch laid down in the cool grass and let Will snuggle into his side. Once Will stopped adjusting and smoothed the quilt, Stretch wrapped his neck around the boy, holding him close and resting his own head on his back hip. "Good night, Stretch," Will said, already half asleep. Stretch closed his eyes and dreamt of the motherland. Chapter 8. The morning came quickly, and the boy and his giraffe were rudely awakened by a sharp hiss. Almost instantly, several streams of water blasted the sleepy duo, hitting them from all angles. Stretch stood up quickly, dropping Will's head from its resting place and whipping him back into reality with a jolt. Will ran for cover in the house, throwing the back door open to see his dad pouring a cup of coffee. "Dad!" Will yelled in a tone indicating imminent danger. "You forgot to turn off the sprinklers!" "Oh, shoot. Sorry about that." Dad ran to the garage, opened the electronic panel on the wall, and input the correct combination of button presses required to kill the sprinkler system. "Sorry, bud," Dad said as he entered the house, returning to his cup of coffee. "Wait, what are you doing outside?" Will's mind struggled in this morning haze. It was difficult to think of a reasonable fib on an empty stomach, so he just told the truth. "Stretch was having a hard time sleeping, so I went out to keep him company." Dad took a sip of his coffee and looked out the window at their new backyard guest star. Stretch was eye deep in the bucket of apples, enjoying his breakfast. "What's the use getting upset? Sure, Will wasn't supposed to leave the room in the middle of the night. He definitely wasn't supposed to sneak out of the house, but what difference did it make? His entire life continued to feel like a surrealist movie, so why not just press forward and play your role?" Will examined Dad's face while he was running through the logic. Dad seemed uncertain, almost perplexed by the simple explanation that was offered. That was just as good as Will saying he was off the hook. He wasn't going to stick around just in case there was some kind of punishment that was coming, though. Dad returned from his stare out the window. I gotta get ready for school," Will blurted out, and he ran up the stairs to shower. Will showered, got dressed, and walked out the back door to say goodbye to Stretch before heading to school. "Stay out of trouble," Will cautioned the tiny-legged giant. "We don't want to give my parents any reason to send you back to the zoo." Stretch, unable to understand a single syllable coming out of Will's mouth, gave him a look of assurance. Whatever the kid was saying, it seemed really important. Will gave Stretch a couple of firm pats and walked toward the gate. Before walking through, he turned around and said loudly, "Seriously, we cannot screw this up." With that final warning, Will started his walk to school. That's when it hit him. Nothing at school was going to change. Sure, there was now a beautiful exotic animal running around in his backyard, but that didn't change the fact that no one at school liked him, and nothing at school was easy. In fact, it only made the day more difficult. Will had always looked forward to leaving school for the day and returning home, but that desire had turned from a dull longing into an excitement he could not contain. At least at lunch, he was able to tell Sonny about what had happened. Finally, the bell rang, ending fourth period, and all the middle school students flooded the cafeteria. Will's muscle memory led him to stand in place in the lunch line and slowly trudge forward, as those in front of him grabbed their meals and left. His body followed the daily routine, but his mind was buzzing, and he used every ounce of his mental capacity, scanning frantically for his Korean friend. Sonny was in for a surprise even bigger than when he had felt when his friend had first had him try jjigae. After grabbing his hard-breaded chicken patty on a whole wheat bun, Will took his tray directly to his normal lunch table. The table had been commandeered by a group of unsuspecting girls back on their first day of school. Sonny was already there, eating something wrapped in leafy greens. "Sonny, I have a giraffe." The words started tumbling out of Will's mouth before the tray even touched the laminate table. "What?" Sonny looked at Will as if he had just told Sonny that the two were actually on the moon right this second. Will leaned forward, getting a little lime jello on his forearm as he repositioned, attempting to keep his voice down while still punctuating his words with the force of truth. "Yeah, like a real giraffe. He's at my house right now." Sonny just continued staring at Will. No words came out, no sounds. Sonny continued making a psalm. "For real?" Will argued. "What do you mean?" "I mean there is a giraffe in my backyard." "Why?" Will couldn't understand how that could even be a question. "Why? Why? It's a giraffe, dude!" The rubber band was now snapping back in Sonny's brain as he was starting to catch up to the conversation. "Oh, like your dad's working on one." I mean, kind of," Will conceded. It maybe wasn't as far-fetched as he originally thought. Will spent the entire lunch period running Sonny through the entire story, how he had gone to the zoo for his birthday, how Stretch is sick, how they went in early Sunday morning to examine the giraffe, and how he walked the animal home using a homemade leash. So, yeah, now I have a giraffe in my backyard, Will finished. Sonny had listened intently, nodding along, never breaking the routine of grabbing bits from his lunch container, adding them to various leaves, and eating them in a single bite. The story was fascinating, but he couldn't afford to spend his entire lunch sitting in polite, rapt attention. Can I come see it? Finally, Sonny was asking the questions Will had expected from square one. Yeah. It was a bit of an anticlimactic conclusion to the most exciting lunchtime conversation to ever grace the middle school cafeteria, but when you reach the end of the conversation, sometimes the landing isn't as smooth as you imagine. There was a beat of strange silence. Then an unfamiliar voice cut through it effortlessly, with a snarky tone only a teenager can exhibit. Oh, shut up! Will turned around to see the blonde girl he had unintentionally exorcised from the lunch table on their first day. She stood up and took a step toward Will. She turned to look at Sonny. You believe this freak? Sonny, crumbling under the pressure of the popular girl grilling him, responded, I don't know. Yeah, okay, she fired back and immediately turned around as the entire gaggle of schools stood in unison and started to leave. As they walked away, she cast one loud volley. Will has a giraffe, everybody! Scattered laughter and a loud drone of packed lunchroom filled Sonny's ears. But Will's head was completely silent. Sonny didn't believe him. After hearing the entire story, Sonny still didn't trust him. As much as it hurt, Will couldn't be mad. You're still coming over after school, right? He asked. Yeah, I'll see you after school. The bell rang out and the children all returned to class. After several more hours of playing what had happened in the cafeteria back in his mind, Will was still in shock. Not that a random kid would go out of their way to torment him, that's just life in middle school, but that his only friend didn't trust him. School ended. The two boys walked together to Will's house. They didn't speak outside of apologizing, as they repeatedly brushed up against each other. They both tried to fit side by side on the narrow sidewalk. As the boys returned to Will Street, Will was feeling more defeated than at lunch. Oh my God! Sonny's voice brought Will's attention up from a pebble that he had been kicking forward every other step. As soon as he looked up, he understood. Stretch's head and neck poked suspiciously out from behind the white vinyl fence of his home. They were at the end of the street, but the truth was immediately apparent. Yes, Will did, in fact, have a giraffe in his backyard. The boys began running to their destination, stopping only once they reached the gate. Will's fingers fumbled along as he excitedly unlatched the door, and they both stepped through the fence, making their way in from the real world to a dreamland. I told you! Will knew he didn't need to say it, but the vindication still felt good. He continued, His name is Stretchy McNecky, but we call him Stretch. He eats apples and will listen to everything you say. Cool. Sonny's mind couldn't comprehend anything Will was saying. There was a giraffe. He was touching a giraffe. A giraffe was staring at him. It was incredible. Stretch did his best to give the new, scared boy a look of comfort, but instead shot a casual look that said, Get this kid away from me. Why is he looking at me like that? Sonny asked as the giraffe's dark eyes shifted from side to side and his stained teeth showed slightly between curled back lips. Will just started laughing. No idea. Sonny began to laugh too. Both boys spent the next few hours teaching Stretch how to make increasingly upsetting facial expressions, each one more horrible and hilarious than the last. Stretch noticed the response and kept up the act, rolling his eyes back, sticking his tongue out, making a tisking noise, shaking his head no. All the world was a stage, and this giraffe was Jim Carrey in Logan, Utah. Chapter 9. A few days had passed since he introduced Sonny to his long-necked friend. Every day, immediately after the final bell rang, the boys had run from school to the Powell's family backyard. Stretch would excitedly watch the boys from over the fence as they hustled down the street, backpacks swaying with each step. He started to look forward to seeing them. Sure, at first it was a bit annoying to see the small humans come with the sole intent of contorting their faces in his direction and taking turns trying to climb on his back, but now the routine was something he enjoyed. Will sometimes even brought a banana or an orange from his school lunch. Treats make anything more enjoyable. Will and Sunny found it hard to focus in school. All day, every day, any thought that did not contain a giraffe was swiftly kicked from their minds and replaced with daydreams of what they may experience once they entered the backyard. Math? No space. Science? No thanks. English? How is that going to help me in life? I already speak it. Unfortunately, there was no elective giraffe-focused class in Cache County Middle School. Between the boys' laser focus on Stretch and the disbelief of a small group of rude girls, the news of Will's exotic animals spread around the school. Every student and teacher had heard the rumor. In a matter of days, none of them believed it. Teachers would scoff and laugh as they discussed it in the teachers' lounge over their homemade peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Students took a more direct approach and mocked Will as he passed them in the hall. Jokes and faces were flung at him every time he walked from one class to another. Interestingly, Will didn't really mind. In fact, he saw a particularly funny face. He would keep it in his mind as something to teach Stretch when he got home. The final bell rang and the foot race to the Powell home began. As the boys flung open the vinyl fence gate to enter the backyard, they discovered a group of people gathered around Stretch. Will's dad was slowly circling the small crowd, who were all focused on the giraffe. Almost immediately, Will's eyes moved from the unexpected vet students to Stretch himself. Stretch was sitting, but not like he did when the two had slept together on that first night. The giraffe was sitting upright, back legs completely bent, front legs extended. He must have learned how to sit from the neighbor's greyhound. Pretty smart giraffe. Will let out an audible chuckle. Sunny started laughing uncontrollably. "What's going on?" Will asked loudly, directing the question at no one in particular. Will's dad turned around. "Oh, hey, bud. I brought the class over to take a hands-on look at Stretch." In addition to providing his students with a great learning experience, he also felt the need to prove to them that he was not going insane and that there was, in fact, a giraffe living in his backyard. Some things you never outgrow, like the need to confirm the surreal life you're living is actually happening. Will just nodded and approached the class with Sunny. As he approached the group, he noticed one class member in a familiar tan ensemble. The zookeeper was standing among the crowd, touching Stretch and taking notes. "You're becoming a vet?" Will asked, looking directly at the zookeeper. "Yeah," a chorus of student voices all answered it at once with conviction. Will ignored the consensus and asked again, "Zoo guy, you're becoming a vet too?" The zookeeper turned his eyes from Stretch and gave a smile. "Hey, good to see you. When it comes to khaki-wearing workers, zookeepers are much more polite than package delivery drivers." "No, I'm not going to be a vet. I'm just checking in on Mr. McNecky." Will cringed slightly when he heard the giraffe's old name spoken aloud. "It's just Stretch now." "Got it," the zookeeper replied with a smile. See, way more polite than any UPS worker Will had ever met. "Actually," the zoo man began again, turning his attention from Will to Will's father, "I did have something I want to ask." "Sure," Dad replied. "What's up?" "We're having our annual fundraiser for the zoo this weekend. It would be great if we could bring Stretch. I know he doesn't belong to the zoo anymore, but he will draw a bigger crowd than a group of deer or turkeys, and we need the money." "Of course," Dad replied without a second thought. "Funding is important." Stretch was going to return to the zoo, the place he had just been rescued from. Will wasn't so sure that was a good idea. He crashed into the conversation with reckless abandon. "Stretch will only come if he gets a big space to run around." The zookeeper thought about it for a minute. Stretchy McNecky hadn't been a huge draw in his enclosure previously. Besides, that enclosure was now being used to showcase an okapi. "Yeah, we could have him in the main grass area," the zoo worker said. devising a plan on the fly. His mind began racing as he mentally rearranged the event layout. The mumbling and hand waving started to concern Will, but he could tell that the request was going to happen. Perfect, said Will. What other reply could there be? Saturday evening arrived. It was time to head back to the zoo for the fundraiser. Will's mom and dad seemed very excited about attending the event, but not for the same reason as Will. Dressing up, socializing, meeting fancy rich people from the community, bleh. Will was excited about showing everyone the new tricks that he had taught Stretch. Not even the tiny bow tie his mom had tied too tight could choke that excitement out of him. The family all met in the living room for one final check-in before leaving the house. Dad looked like a family-friendly James Bond, wearing a black tuxedo and slicked-back hair. Mom looked like a movie star, sporting a long, flowing red dress and heavy makeup. Mr. and Mrs. Powell had transformed into an approachable Mr. and Mrs. Smith in just under an hour's time. Will was wearing non-jean pants and a shirt with buttons. When you include the bow tie, it's probably the most dressed up he'd been in his entire 13 years of life. Everyone looks so great, Mom said, the look on her face indicating any more time spent would cause her to shed tears of joy. Well, we are an attractive bunch, just need a little touch-up, Dad said, attempting to tag a light joke onto Mom's compliment. Can we go now? Will asked, half pleading. You can start heading over, Dad gave Will a nod. Mom and I still need to get some things together. We'll meet you there. That was all Will needed to hear. He ran out the back door. Stretch was sitting in his dog-like stance, drinking from the bucket of water. Let's go, Stretch! Will yelled excitingly as he ran up to the giraffe and gave his leg a firm pat. Stretch's head rose from the bucket and turned towards Will. Upon seeing the boy, Stretch couldn't hold in his surprise. His top lip curled upward, displaying his large teeth. He shook his head and let out a loud laugh, just like he'd heard Will and Sunny do non-stop during their time together. The booming, wheezing laugh shocked Will, who took a step back. Then a smile crept across Will's face as well. The two burst out laughing and fell to the ground. Hearing a strange noise, Dad rushed into the back door. As soon as he had lifted his head, he saw his son and the gigantic animal rolling back and forth on the lawn, laughing uncontrollably. Will? Dad asked tentatively. Is everything okay? Will could barely breathe, but between fits of laughter he was able to squeak out a yes. Okay, good, Dad said, still a little unsure. You better get going. Dad was right. They were going to be late. They couldn't be late. Will was going to show everyone how funny his giraffe was. He didn't want to miss a minute. The family arrived at the event just as the gates opened. Mom and Dad in the family truck, Will and Stretch on foot. The zookeeper was waiting out front in his normal tan uniform. Once he saw Will and Stretch, he immediately directed them to a large, open, fenced-in green area in the center of the zoo. Speaking quickly as they walked to the area where Stretch would spend the event, the zookeeper said, I got him a bag, as big a place as I could. There's a bunch of lettuce in there for him to eat. Will was hardly paying attention to the frantic zookeeper's words. It was clear the zookeeper had a lot on his mind, and that getting Stretch inside that fence was just one small check on a very large mental list. The keeper opened the gate on the small 5-foot-tall temporary fence and let Stretch and Will inside. Remember to lock up when you come back out, he cautioned. Lock up? Will wasn't worried about Stretch breaking out of here and going full Godzilla on a group of dolled-up adults. The giraffe was calm and kind as a monk with a full stomach. Will was more concerned with the fact that the keeper assumed Will wasn't going to spend the entire evening inside the fence with Stretch. I mean, what is a kid supposed to do at an event like this anyway? The food barely looks like food. The drinks were all fancy and spiked with lavender or sage. The only entertainment outside of Stretch was conversations with tuxedo-donning old men and women who somehow determined wearing a ball gown to a zoo would be a good idea. This was no place for kids, especially not for a kid like Will. Will spent the first hour of the event within Stretch's temporary prison, patting the giraffe's sides, racing him to the other end of the enclosure, and just people watching. Oddly, even though the zookeeper was adamant about the importance of Stretch's return to the success of the event, it didn't seem like a single soul paid any attention to the short-legged former resident. In fact, most of the fancily dressed men and women just seemed to try to actively ignore the boy and the giraffe. They were here to make connections and fulfill their obligation to the zoo and the community, not to actually enjoy what their money had been building. Certainly not to look at the face of a failure of the system that they were funding. After Stretch and Will finished another sprint across the grassy field, the giraffe observed a group of tuxedoed men drinking champagne near the fence. He calmly walked over to get a closer look. The men were responsive, turning their attention from the middle of their standing circle to the tall, curious horse giraffe. As Stretch got closer to the group, the men all lined up and leaned on the fence, resting their hands along the top of the railing. Stretch saw his chance. Before anyone could react, Stretch extended his long black tongue into the champagne glass a man was sporting, into the champagne glass of a man sporting a cowboy hat. His tongue filled the vessel, and he quickly lifted it up and knocked back the entire glass. Once the effervescent liquid had flowed into his mouth, he shook his head, retracting his tongue, and sent the narrow glass flying back behind the men. The empty projectile narrowly missed the peacock who had been roaming free on the grounds and shattered on the walkway. Stretch raised up his head, shaking it back and forth to clear the fuzzy sharpness from his cheeks and throat. Will and the men all looked at one another. Will's face was filled with fear, and he detected a tinge of fear on the face of each of the fence-leaning gang as well. After everyone in the group had exchanged looks, they began to laugh. Not just a tiny chuckle, a full belly laugh. One of the men doubled over and sat with his back against the fence. Another interlocked his fingers in his hair and spun around. Another man started hopping up and down, looking like a hysterical Yosemite Sam. Will was laughing harder than any of them, and Stretch was laughing his loud grinding laugh, prancing around like a reindeer who was just told he had Christmas off this year. The scene was too much to ignore. A crowd began to gather and murmur with one another. Everyone was wondering what could have happened to cause the child, rich old men, and a giraffe to cackle like a pack of hyenas. They wouldn't get their answer immediately. Everyone involved was out of breath and clutching their sides. A beautiful older lady arrived at a steady clip and ran over to the man in the cowboy hat. "Honey, honey, what's so funny?" she asked, beginning to laugh herself. The cowboy used his knuckle to wipe a tear from his eye. He took a deep, quivering breath. Finally, he spoke, managing to only squeeze out one short sentence. "That's one funny giraffe." The declaration made all the men start laughing all over again. Will, exhausted from laughing, was now just laying down staring at the sky while trying to catch his breath between giggles. Stretch, feeling a little self-conscious, stopped his silly dance and now stood in normal giraffe mode. Will climbed back to his feet after seeing the men's reaction to Stretch. He knew he was safe to do what he had been dying to do all night. "You want to see his funny face?" The cowboy stood back up and turned towards Will. His face was bright red and moist. Will was unsure if it was from tears or sweat. Either way, it was from laughing. "Sure," the cowboy said with a chuckle. Will turned away from the crowd and faced Stretch. "Hey, Stretch," he started. Then he stuck his tongue out to one side and crossed his eyes. Stretch followed suit. The giraffe lowered his head to the boy's eye level, stuck out his black tongue to the right side of his mouth, crossed his eyes, and flicked his ears back and forth for good measure. The crowd erupted with laughter. Encouraged by their reaction, Will started running through every face he and Sonny had been teaching Stretch over the last week. Stretch, the greatest performer in Logan, followed along, making sure he displayed every look to the ever-growing crowd. The repertoire was deep, and the boy and his giraffe put it all on display. Wide eyes, tongues out, ears wiggling, winking, sneering, raising eyebrows, lips curled, the fawns, the bean, the cage, the Scott. Every bit of facial contortion Will was able to pull, Stretch could do even better. Stretch's giraffe features adopted every move, somehow making it even more exaggerated. The event went on for another hour. That entire hour was filled with funny faces, laughter, and many, many rich people fumbling their way through selfies with Stretch. At the end of the night, every guest left in high spirits, no doubt securing another year's worth of donations. Once everyone had been ushered out of the front gate, the zookeeper entered the grassy stage and approached Will and Stretch. "Thanks for coming. You guys killed it." "No problem," Will answered simply, smiling at Stretch in amazement. "You know," the zookeeper continued, "if you ever need some money, apparently you could kill in the stand-up circuit." He laughed to himself and headed towards the fence's gate, motioning for the boy and the giraffe to follow. It may have been an offhanded comment, like when your daughter finishes her beginning swimming lessons and you say, "Maybe you'll make it to the Olympics one day." The meaning behind it is to be encouraging. Something funny about Olympic swimmers, though. They all had to start somewhere. Will took the comment to heart. Money? Who couldn't use some of that? Chapter 10. Will was living in the clouds after their side-splitting performance at the zoo fundraiser. Now he had tasted approval from adults for doing things that killed in first grade. He never wanted to go back. He didn't even get in trouble for the broken glass that kicked off the entire face-stretching show. It's like being funny was his ticket to a life of fame, fortune, and never getting grounded ever again. Now he just needed to follow the advice of the zookeeper and book some shows for Stretch. It was fall break, so Will had a few days off of school. Until last night, he had intended on spending the entire break playing in the backyard with Sunny and Stretch. Now, there was no time to play. He had a star to make. Will sat at the family computer, opened the browser, and searched Comedy Club, Logan, Utah. Turns out, a rural area of a rural state is not a comedy hotspot, like Will had hoped. There were a few potential places to perform: a by-the-slice pizza place, the university theater, and the local theater in the town where old people and college kids mixed together to put on odd interpretations of Shakespeare's works. Will called each one, only to find that booking a show was going to be more difficult than he initially thought. The pizza place answered the phone on the first ring. "Pizza Slice, are you placing an order?" Will spoke in the most mature voice he could manage. No, I'm a performer, and I would like to play a show at your restaurant." The pizza peddler on the other end of the call could instantly tell she was working with a middle schooler. She decided to entertain the idea. "Okay, we have some spaces available for performers this week. What's your act?" Shoot, Will hadn't thought that far ahead. Like when his dad had asked him what he was doing in the backyard the first night Stretch lived with them, Will decided honesty was probably the best answer. "I have this giraffe. We make funny faces together." That was not what the pizza girl was expecting to hear. "You what?" she replied, genuinely thinking she misunderstood the description. "My giraffe and I, we make faces, funny faces. People love it." "Like a puppet?" "No, like a giraffe." "Right. Right." There was a moment of silence. Then the silence was broken on the side of the pizza shop. "I would love to see it, but no animals are allowed in the shop. Sorry." Will didn't even think about that. He wouldn't want any kind of wild animal in the restaurant where he was eating either, not to mention Stretch's propensity to steal people's food and drinks. "I understand. Thank you anyway," Will replied, trying to stay professional. "Sure, good luck." The pizza shop hung up the phone. Booking calls with the other venues didn't yield any better results. The university theater was only available for school-sponsored events. Will would be allowed to submit a formal request for sponsorship and present that request at a board meeting for the Utah State University Theater Management Committee, which would meet again in just a few short months. Not ideal. The local theater was already booked out for the rest of the year. Hamlet and Eggs and An End of Summer Night's Dream were already cast and had been doing dress rehearsals. No room for an up-and-coming funny face show featuring the most talented exotic mammal in the county. Frustrated, having exhausted all of his options, Will called Sunny and asked if he would come over to the house. Sunny arrived just a few minutes later. He had already finished all of his chores and was simply waiting for an invitation before coming to the Powell home. Sunny was always polite like that. The two boys walked to the backyard where Stretch was laying in the grass. They pet Stretch, while Will told Sonny the whole story about the fundraiser, how Stretch stole a glass of alcohol, drank it, threw it over the fence, and made faces at all the grown-ups. He told Sonny how he took control and made faces with Stretch, each one making the old people laugh louder and harder than the last. "We even did the bean!" "I taught him that," Sonny yelped. "I know, it killed!" Sonny had never been so proud. Will continued. "So the zookeeper said he thinks we should start doing comedy shows, but no one wants to hire us." Sonny quickly replied, "What about the theater?" "They're already booked." "The other theater?" "Booked too. I called everywhere in town and no one will let us perform." "We could perform here," Sonny suggested. "My parents would kill me if I had a bunch of people show up at our house." Will was probably right. Performing at the house was not ideal. Will's dad came into the backyard carrying several heads of lettuce. "Hey, boys," he said as he made his way to Stretch's food bucket. "Sonny, how are ya?" Dad loved to talk to every one of Will's friends individually. It was so embarrassing. "Good, Mr. Powell," Sonny replied. Will didn't have time for pleasantries. Fall break was short, and he had a problem that needed solving. "We want to book a comedy show, but no one will let us perform." Dad laughed and shook his head. "Hollywood ain't easy." "Dad, I'm serious," Will said, half a whine. We were so good last night." That was true. Dad knew Stretch and Will had not only drawn a crowd, but they had entertained everyone for nearly an hour. Something about the novelty of a giraffe who could do tricks on command had serious appeal. I mean, P.T. Barnum built an entire empire on similar attractions. Dad also knew that his son was only 13 years old, and Stretch was a dwarfed giraffe with questionable health and no tail. Not exactly a winning formula. Still, when one is a parent, they should support their child in chasing their dreams, lest they end up in a soulless profession, making a decent income but wishing they could trade it all for a bit of freedom. "I'll tell you what," Dad began. "I'll do whatever I can to make sure you and Stretch get your first show." There. Supportive, but not overpromising. Well, maybe he should be a bit more specific, to not get Will's hopes up. "I'm not an entertainer. I'm not sure there's a lot I can do," he hedged. "Thanks, Dad." Will knew his dad didn't have the power of a booking agent. This was something he and Sonny would need to figure out on their own. Satisfied with the results of the conversation, Dad went back in the house. "So what do we do now?" Sonny asked. "I guess we can start calling places in Salt Lake," Will suggested. "Salt Lake? How would we get Stretch all the way down there?" Although transporting the talent to the venue was only step 2 in setting up a performance, Will hadn't thought that far either. How would you get a giraffe an hour south? The whole idea seemed to fall apart before it even started. Defeated, the boys tried to cheer themselves up by playing with Stretch. After a long day of making faces and playing tag with the small giraffe, Sonny and Will made their way in the house for dinner. Mom had made pigs in a blanket. Will loved hot dogs, so seeing tubed meat enveloped in cheap pastry from a can was a welcome sight. For Sonny, the over-processed sodium-filled torpedoes were a bullet he would just have to take. A small price to pay for the privilege of hanging out with his best friend and a giraffe all day. As the boys and Will's mom sat down to eat, the phone rang. Mom stood up and walked over to answer. "Hello?" She was always sounded so polite when answering the phone. Her voice carried a smile you could feel on the other end of the conversation. "Oh," she sounded slightly concerned. "Let me ask." She put the phone on the counter. "Will, did you call a pizza place earlier?" Will immediately felt like he was in trouble. There was no reason for him to worry. He hadn't done anything wrong, but that didn't stop his heart from racing. "Yeah, I called earlier," he said. Mom picked the phone back up. "Sorry about that. Yes, my son did call you earlier." There was a pause on the end of the conversation as Mom listened intently on what was being said. Once again, Mom put the phone down on the counter. "Will," he was getting the extra polite voice. "Did you say you wanted to perform at the pizza place?" Will needed to tread lightly. "Yes," he ventured out to the edge, ready to justify his answer if needed. Mom picked up the phone once again. Yes, he did. Silence. Oh, okay, I'll tell him. Mom hung up the phone. They said their act for tonight is unable to make it and that you could perform tonight if you'd like. Will couldn't believe it. He smiled just as big as he had last night when he realized the old men may want to see more. He couldn't contain his excitement. He threw his hands up and let out a yell, high-fiving Sonny. Congratulations, Mom said calmly with a little smile. I didn't even know you two were working on an act. Oh, not me and Sonny, me and Stretch. Mom's smile turned into a mixture of concern and confusion. The giraffe? Just then, Dad walked in. I smell wieners! Classic. Dad loves to tell a terrible joke every time he enters a room. Dad! Will blurted out. We booked a show! The whiplash of expecting a calm dinner to finding out his 13-year-old son had booked a performance with a giraffe who lives in their backyard was enough to sprout a gray hair in both his beard and the top of his head. Oh, you did, Dad said, trying to stay supportive. Way to go! Mom looked at Dad. The look said, we probably should have had a conversation about this, Bruce. Mom was very good at communicating with Dad through quick glances and intense but brief eye contact. Will couldn't let this little tiff derail his good news. We need to get down to the pizza slice, Dad. Dad, you said you would help me with my first show. Can you drive us in the truck? A father is nothing without his word, and he's even less if he goes back on that word to his own children. He was trapped. This was happening. He had to be supportive. Sure, Dad said with a sigh. Let's get you and Stretch to the pizza place. Chapter 11. Before any of them knew what was happening, Will, Dad, and Sonny were standing in the driveway, trying to figure out how to get a giraffe with short legs into the bed of an old pickup truck. Sure, Stretch would fit inside the bed laying down, and they would need to be careful of power lines and low-hanging branches as they drove to downtown to the pizza slice. But that wasn't the difficult part. The real puzzle was identifying exactly how to get Stretch safely into the back in the first place. Well, we can't lift him, Will said. When solving a problem, sometimes it's nice to first state the obvious hurdles when finding a solution. Sure, Dad's voice trailed off as he considered other options. We could build a ramp, Sonny suggested, shrugging his shoulders. That's what I was thinking too, Dad agreed. But out of what? We can't just put a piece of plywood up against the tailgate and have him walk up. Why not? Will asked without thinking through the situation. Then his mind caught up to his mouth. Oh, because it would break. Yeah, Dad confirmed. Then another thought. Come to think of it, I'm not sure the truck can support his weight anyway. It might break the axle. The Powell family definitely could not afford to ruin the old farm truck. It had been their main mode of transportation for years. It's not that they loved the truck or had any special attachment to the vehicle, more that they had a special attachment to not needing to buy a new car. They were in a real pickle. Pizza Slice needed them as soon as possible. In Will's mind, there was already a crowd of hundreds of people forming outside the pizza restaurant, just waiting for him and Stretch to arrive. In reality, there were just a few families out to grab a couple slices of pepperoni. No one went to Pizza Slice for the live music, but the staff liked to support local artists. Also, it was nice to have some variety in sound and scenery when working a minimum wage pizza gig. Will could always walk Stretch downtown to the restaurant. That's how he got Stretch home from the zoo, after all. The only issue is that walking takes a while. They needed someone now. That's when Will remembered he had a secret weapon. A dad who loves to tell jokes and who promised him to help him with his first performance however he could. Perfect. Dad, Will started, I need you to go and start the performance. Sonny and I will walk Stretch down and take over the show once we get there. Dad was not even considering that as a potential solution. He did not want to make a fool out of himself on stage, but he also wanted to be careful to let Will down easy. Will, he started, that's an interesting idea. I'm not really a performer, though. I don't want to ruin your show. You won't be ruining the show. You'd be saving it. Will's intense response was more than enough to let Dad know that his son was serious about the suggestion. Will, I can't. Dad, you can. You told me you were going to help me with my first show, and I need your help. Please. As much as Dad didn't want to become an impromptu comedian at the downtown pizza parlor, he did promise his son he would help. He also couldn't help but be impressed by Will's conviction. He could be brave. It was just this once. Besides, how many people could be going to a small town pizza restaurant on a Monday night anyway? Okay, I'll do it, Dad said, giving Will a hug. Please start heading over as soon as you can. I'm going to need your help. You got it, Dad. With that, Dad ushered the boys away from the back of the old pickup truck, climbed in the cab, and started the ancient thing. It leapt to life immediately, part of the reason he'd kept it all these years. He backed down the driveway and started down the road toward the middle of town. In the rear view, he could see the boys excitedly running up to the gate to let out Stretch. The sight made him smile. Now he only had to come up with roughly 30 minutes of stand-up comedy in his 5-minute drive. It's not like professional comedians with decades of experience spend their entire lives doing that same thing. Back at the house, Will and Sonny had already attached the rope leash to Stretch, and they were leading him down the road at a brisk pace. Will explained the situation to Stretch as they walked. So I worked all day to get us a show. Everyone said, "No, you can't perform here." Then me and Sonny kept thinking of places you could perform. We even thought of going down to Salt Lake. But when we went to eat pigs in a blanket, someone called us. It was the Pizza Slice. Their singer canceled tonight and they needed someone to perform. That's you. We're going to a show. Not only was Will walking quickly, he was talking faster and faster as he explained the events of the day that led to this current opportunity. He was out of breath by the time they made it to the end of the street, but, like his ancestors, he continued pressing westward, with the promise of a better life just over the next hill. Dad arrived at the Pizza Slice and was relieved to find that the restaurant still had plenty of empty space. He wouldn't be playing to a packed house. At least there was a silver lining to this kid supporting storm cloud. He exited the cab of the truck, took a deep breath, and walked in. Immediately, as he opened the restaurant door, he was hit with a yeasty smell of proofing dough. The place had just opened for the night, and the entire display case was full of fresh pizzas. The large dining room was completely made of brick floors and brick walls surrounded, making him feel like he was trapped in an old-timey oven. The heat didn't help ease his thought either. He was about to be roasted, cooked alive on stage by the parents and elementary-age kids who were about to become his audience. He approached the counter to accept his fate. "Welcome to Pizza Slice. For here to go." Neither. I'm, entertainment. It felt weird as soon as the words left his lips. The woman behind the counter seemed just as unsure as Dad felt. "You are? I thought it was a kid." "Yes, it is a kid," he started, trying to reassure the pizza saleswoman that he wasn't just some weirdo who wandered into the shop to wreak havoc. "He's my kid, actually. He's running a little late, and I'm here to fill in until he arrives." The look on the pizza baroness's face immediately told Dad that getting the show started on time was not of great concern. Maybe he wouldn't need to get on stage after all. Then she spoke. "Great, Mike's hooked up, stage is in the corner." She pointed him to the back corner of the dining room. "Oh, great, thanks." Maybe he misread her face. Maybe she actually read on his that he was worried about performing, and she wanted to see what would happen. Either way, he thanked her and made his way to the stage with only one thought. Will had better come quick. Will and Sonny had just reached the edge of downtown. The old buildings were marked with recessed stone carvings and detail work reserved for only the most expensive artisans these days. Will always loved the old part of town. His appreciation for history and architecture was far beyond his years. In his mind, it made him a bit of an old soul. In the eyes of his peers, it made him a bit of a weirdo. Walking to the downtown area had been fast but simple. The walk throughout downtown was anything but. As soon as they reached the busier part of town, cars began honking. Every person they passed on the sidewalk stared and tried to avoid the odd pack of misfits. Every child they encountered tried to talk to and touch Stretch, and Stretch was not a fan. He would glare at each one, scaring them. and in one case causing a child's parents to scold the boys for not controlling their animal. They only had a few blocks to go until they reached the pizza slice. Good thing, too. Will's feet were killing him. He was starting to get a stitch in his side, too. When had he transformed into such an old man? Maybe the stress of becoming a top talent manager in Logan, Utah was starting to take its toll. A few minutes later, Will, Sonny, and Stretch made it to the restaurant. Will instructed Sonny and Stretch to stay outside while he went in to talk to the manager. Sonny took the leash and dutifully stood on the sidewalk outside the pizza parlor. Will stepped inside to see his dad stumbling through a joke. Kangaroos have pouches right in front of their stomachs, right here. Isn't that crazy? What if we had that? I probably wouldn't lose my phone as much. Yikes. Will confidently walked up to the counter. Welcome to Pizza Slice. Is this for here or to go? Hi, I'm here for the show. The show is free for all paying customers. Do you want a slice? No, I'm here to perform. The lady behind the counter gave him a closer look. Ah, you're more like what I was expecting. She gave him a genuine smile. Happy you could make it on such short notice. Where's the giraffe? The giraffe. That's half the reason she called him back. She hadn't heard a creative pitch to perform like that in years. The last one was a real-time painter who pitched his show as Jimi Hendrix meets Van Gogh meets a hot fudge sundae. Oddly, after the performance, that's exactly how she would explain it to someone too. Oh, he's outside, Will responded, completely unaware that the lady behind the counter was recalling a psychedelic post-impressionist dairy dream. Good idea. Let's keep him outside. All right. Stage is over there where your dad is, she said, pointing to the corner where Dad was attempting to do crowd work. Will was confused. I thought animals weren't allowed in here. Yeah, they aren't. So maybe we could just have the show outside, Will suggested. The pizza girl decided playing along would be best. Sure, I'll just let everyone know the show's outside. You go out and get ready. With that, Will left the restaurant. The pizza lady walked out from behind the counter and over to the stage. Dad was so relieved to see someone coming to throw him a lifeline. She jumped on the tiny stage and took the mic Dad was offering. Thank you for the warm-up act, she said warmly, clapping as Dad walked off stage. No one clapped along or joined in. Tough crowd. The main event, she continued, is out front. Please make your way out there when you're ready. With that, she placed the mic back in its place on the mic stand and walked out the front door. As she approached the door, she heard the low droning sound coming from outside. Curious, she opened the door. Across the threshold was a giraffe. A real giraffe, on the sidewalk outside of the pizza restaurant. Crazy. Once she got over the shock of seeing a giraffe, her view widened, and she received a real shock. There were about 100 people packed up and down the sidewalk, all pointing at the giraffe, taking pictures, and pushing one another to get a better view. Hiring this kid may have been the best move she ever made. Are we good to go? Will's voice snapped her out of her wonder. Yeah, good to go. Great, let's do it, Stretch. With that, Will pulled out his ears, filled both cheeks with air, and rolled back his eyes to make an eyeless monkey face you may recognize from your time in the elementary school bus. Then, the part nobody recognized, the giraffe lowered his head and made the same face, turning back and forth to ensure the entire crowd got a good look. This was going to be big. Chapter 12. Will felt lighter than air for the rest of the week. Fall break had blessed him with time away from school, and there was no way any other day during the break could live up to that first one. He and Stretch had booked a performance, and they had crushed it. After showing the monkey face, Stretch really took over the show. He ran through every funny face the children had taught him, back to back. A natural performer. He also took a slice of artichoke pizza out of one old lady's hand and used his tongue to place it on top of his head like a tiny cheese baseball cap. The crowd couldn't get enough. The performance went so well, the pizza girl told him he and Stretch were welcome back to perform anytime. They had even gotten $20 and a free pizza. It may be a bit too early to tell, but Will was pretty sure that that day was the best day of his life. How could it possibly get any better? Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the rest of the week flew by in a blur. Will and Sonny spent all day every day in Will's backyard playing with Stretch, running through their repertoire of funny faces and racing across the yard. Stretch was happy to spend time with the boys. Being alone in the backyard while all the pals were at school and work was peaceful, but he much preferred the attention and pats on the side that the boys provided. Soon enough, a new week approached, and the peace would return. After experiencing the smashing success of his performance, Will had even less interest in school than he had before, since Stretch moved in, and now he was also probably the biggest thing to ever hit Cache County. It turns out he wasn't the only one distracted at school. Will's experience at school continued to evolve. When the school year started, he was almost completely ignored. When he first told Sonny about Stretch, the rumor of him having a giraffe spread, and he started getting ridiculed. Now, after fall break, everyone seemed a lot more friendly. Kids Will had only seen in passing would wave to him, give him a nod of recognition, or offer a high five as he passed them in the hall. Teachers would give him a shy thumbs up, even a few of the teachers who he'd never seen before. Will thought maybe his mom was right. Maybe your experience is determined by your perspective. He started to feel happy about living in Logan, and Logan had started being happy to see him. Who knew it was that easy? At lunch, Will joined the line to grab his food as usual. Not like usual, some of the other kids in front of him in the line turned around to introduce themselves. Blair and Taryn. After a quick introduction, they began peppering Will with questions. How did he learn all those faces? What do you feed him? Was the Pizza Hat your idea? Will didn't expect the attention. He quickly whipped his head back and forth between the girls as they asked alternating questions, not giving any time for him to respond. He closed his eyes, took a quick breath, then put the pieces together. Oh, these girls must have come to the show. Will, being a polite young man, tried to answer all their questions before asking his own. Me and Sonny taught him. Apples, bananas, and lettuce. He did that all on his own. Were you at the pizza slice? The girls' faces wore slight confusion as their brains tried to sort out Will's answers. After a moment, Blair answered, Oh no, we watched the video. The video? Will didn't have a cell phone. His parents believed that once they gave him a phone, he would finally be grown, and they weren't ready to unleash whatever came along with that decision in their home. So, Mom and Dad planned on keeping Will away from a phone as long as possible. The girls, seeing his confusion, pulled out their phones and showed him a video of Stretch grinning, then placing a pizza atop his dull horns. Everyone's talking about it. It turns out the secret to having a good experience in middle school isn't actually a positive attitude. It's sharing the stage with an extremely talented local celebrity. Either way, Will was happy he wasn't the target of his schoolmates' barrage of bad intentions any longer. Still, standing in the lunch line, Sonny came running up and stopped by Will's side. Hey, Sonny! Will greeted his friend with a pat on the shoulder. Did you forget your lunch? Dude! Sonny had dropped his normal, calm, reserved body language. Did you see the video? Yeah, Will replied, gesturing to Blair and Taryn. The girls giggled and started whispering to each other. What do we do? Sonny asked, half concerned, half unable to contain his excitement. Will had no idea. What was there to do? They had done the performance, things had gone well, and until the next show, that was that. I guess we can perform at Pizza Slice again, Will suggested. Well, yeah, Sonny replied. I mean, what else? Will just shrugged. His whole world was starting to feel weird, and not in the happy, carefree way that he had experienced during the remainder of fall break. The remainder of the school day was more of the same. Kids Will had never spoken to stopped him to take pictures. Groups of friends were gathered around 6-inch screens watching the video on repeat. People pointed at him and whispered in class. For the first time since moving to Logan, Will wished he could focus on school. Anything would be better than being the center of the middle school universe. School ended, and the boys made their way over to the Powell home. Once they arrived, Mom was waiting for them in the kitchen. Hey, William, how was school? It was okay, Will replied. Just okay? Did something happen? Well, Will took a moment to focus. Then he unloaded. All the kids at school saw a video of me and Stretch at Pizza Slice. They all think it's the funniest thing they've ever seen. Now they won't leave me alone. It's like everybody's watching me all the time. They're taking pictures of me and asking me tons of questions about Stretch. Mom, being the great parent she was, stopped what she was doing and listened intently. Her answer surprised Will. Well, that sounds kind of nice. Nice? Yeah, nice. People liked your show. You must have done a good job, honey. Way to go. What a supportive mom. Will thought about it. She was right. If the show had been bad, no one would have taken the time to watch it. They weren't trying to bombard him, they were trying to learn more. The show with Stretch has ignited a spirit of excitement in the school. Nothing ever happened in Logan. Now something genuinely intriguing was happening, and Will was ground zero. Thanks, Mom, Will said with a smile. Then he and Sonny ran out the back door to go and see Stretch. The boys spent the next few hours telling each other about their experiences at school. Together, they caught Stretch up on the events of the day and began to wonder about what tomorrow would bring. Stretch listened intently, not understanding a single word. One day, he really would need to either learn English or teach these boys how to communicate in Giraffe. Just before dusk, Dad opened the back door and called out to the boys. Yeah, Dad, Will replied. There's someone on the phone for you and Stretch. The pizza slice? No, something way bigger. Chapter 13. Dad put the phone call on speaker and set the phone down on the counter. Will nervously looked at the dark screen. Hello? Hey, William, my name is Mandy. I'm a booking agent for Rachel Willis. Okay, hi. Will wasn't sure how to react, but being called William sent a familiar shiver of disapproval up his spine. Hi, I'm excited to talk to you. Thanks. Silence. Dad cut in after a moment in the conversation, descending into a void of nothing. Mandy wanted to talk to you about Stretch. Mandy, the consummate show business professional, picked up off that cue. Right, I was calling to see if you and Stretch would be interested in performing on the Rachel Willis show. Rachel Willis was the biggest daytime talk show in the U.S. Sometimes Will would turn it on when he was homesick. The show mostly consisted of middle-aged women talking to other middle-aged women who had large audiences consisting of middle-aged women. Not really something a 13-year-old boy watched with rapt attention. They did occasionally have fun dog tricks, though, so he let the show play in the background while he sat at the family computer, just in case an interesting segment happened to appear. Isn't that in New York? It sure is. We would pay to have you and Stretch come out to the show and perform on our stage. The whole country would get to enjoy you and your giraffe. How are you going to move Stretch to New York? Will wasn't trying to throw a wrench in the plans. He genuinely had no idea how they would be able to move a giraffe across the country when he and his dad were unable to effectively move Stretch around town. Don't worry about that. Rachel saw the video of your performance and she wants you on the show. We'll work with experts to figure out how to safely transport Stretch. That all sounded good to Will. If Stretch was going to safely make it there, he had no other concerns. Skipping school to fly to New York and perform on TV with Stretch was going to be the best day of his life. How could it not be? Yeah, okay, Will said. Great. I'll figure out all the details and call you back with all the information in a couple of days. The show will likely be mid-next week. It sounded like Mandy was quickly picking up steam with the intention of closing the call after getting the yes. Dad quickly cut in. Mandy, Will is only 13 years old. We'll need to accompany him on the trip. Mom opened her eyes wide and silently nodded furiously at Dad. Of course. I'll book travel and lodging for all three of you and Stretch. Perfect, thank you. No, thank you, Mandy said, and she hung up the call. The Powells and Sonny all collectively exhaled and looked at one another. Was this really happening? The Powells were going to New York City to be on the biggest daytime talk show in the country? Mom was the one to break the silence. Let's have a quick family meeting. Sonny, feeling really awkward about being in the middle of the Powells getting their big break, piped up for the first time since he came in the house. I've got to go home, homework and stuff. Sonny didn't wait for a response. He waved goodbye and walked out the front door. Okay, Dad said. Family meeting. What's on your mind? He asked, looking at Mom. She turned her attention to Will, locking his eyes. William, this is a very special opportunity. I'm very proud of you and very excited about you and Stretch. I'm worried about what will happen if we go on this show. Why? Will couldn't really understand what Mom was trying to say. She was just excited. She just excitedly nodded when Dad got her a trip out of the deal. But now it sounded like not only was she not going to take it, she might take it away from Will as well. I just don't think fame is a good idea for a boy your age. It's not about me, Mom. It's about Stretch. Everyone loves watching him, and he loves performing. Dad decided now was the right time to enter the family meeting. The exposure could help Stretch. Logan isn't the best place for him to live out his life. We can't just keep a giraffe in our backyard forever. The national attention could help find him a home. The conversation was quickly morphing into a whole new beast, one that Will was not ready to even entertain. Find Stretch a home? This was his home. Will's head was spinning. He spent every evening taking care of Stretch, feeding him, teaching him new skills. Was that not enough? Mom looked at the faces of Will and Dad. Okay, we can go to Rachel Willis. Chapter 14. A few days later, the Powell family received another phone call from the bubbly Mandy. The call was quick, efficient, and much more transactional than her first audio encounter with the family. Mandy started the call by asking if they had a pen and paper. Once Mom confirmed that they did, Mandy started rattling off details about flights, travel agenda items, things they would be allowed to bring, travel arrangements for Stretch, things they could expect to take home with them, hotel information, every tidbit of information required for the Powells to get their giraffe to New York City. Honestly, Mandy probably could have just told them all to sit still in their living room and arrange the entire process of picking them up and shipping them to New York just as easily. But there were rules against that type of thing in the United States. Any questions? Mandy asked cheerfully. I don't think so, Mom replied. Excellent. I'll send you an email with the boarding passes, hotel confirmation, and a summary of our call. If you need anything else, text me on this number. We will, thank you. No problem. The animal transport agency we've hired will be by to pick up Stretch tomorrow morning. It sounds like they don't need anything from you except access to Stretch's living space. That sounds easy enough, replied Dad. Great. We'll see you in New York in a few days. With that, Mandy hung up the phone. Will noticed that she always ended the conversations abruptly, not in a rude way. He assumed that you have to do that if you have a lot to do and not a lot of time, you can just exit conversations once there's nothing left to say. The entire Powell family stood around the counter looking at the phone. The conversation was a blur. Good thing Mom had taken notes. Dad was the first to speak. Well, it sounds like we're going to have a fun little family vacation. New York with my boys, Mom added with a smile, alternating her glance between Will, her little boy, and Dad, her big boy. Cool. I'll go tell Stretch, Will added, already heading toward the backyard. In the backyard, Stretch was laying flat on his back, spread eagle, limbs completely akimbo, basking in the sun like a 20-something at the beach building their base tan. Will approached and laid down in the cool grass next to Stretch's lengthy neck. The up-and-coming comedy duo laid in silence for a few minutes, enjoying the sun and cool breeze that made its way down from the mountains. Will had been excited for weeks at a time now. Ever since Stretch had come to live in his backyard, it was nice to take a little break and reach equilibrium. Once he felt calm, he turned to look at Stretch and began to talk in a slow, careful tone. Hey, Stretch, we're going to go to New York City in a few days. All of us. You, me, Mom, Dad, everyone. We're going to perform again. This time we'll be on TV. Don't be nervous. It's going to be great. Stretch continued staring at the sky, letting the calm fall day set the vibe in his mind. He didn't understand a word Will had said. Stretch didn't know what New York City was. He didn't know how to perform. He had no way to comprehend the magic of electronic circuits transferring images from across the country to a screen within the homes of millions of Americans. He didn't know what it was like to be nervous, although he had felt it before back when he last lived among other giraffes. He also certainly didn't know what about this performance was going to be great. He did enjoy spending time with Will, though. He decided he would continue to relax in the sun next to his best friend and listen to the gibberish coming from his mouth for as long as Will wanted to be there. That's what best friends are for. The next morning, a crew of men with a very large truck arrived outside the Powell house. They had a quick conversation with Dad, who led them around through the gate. Stretch went with the men and entered the back of the truck. There was an assortment of fruit and vegetables in there, and a gigantic tub of water. Stretch had never been so excited about entering a large box. A few days later, a driver with a very large SUV arrived at the Powell house. He had a quick conversation with Dad, who led him to the stack of suitcases the Powell family had prepared for the trip. The luggage went with the man to the back of the SUV. Inside the vehicle, Will found there was an assortment of treats and several bottles of water. Will had never been so excited about entering a stranger's vehicle. Chapter 15. After traveling across the country, settling into their fancy hotel room, and getting a ride from the hotel to the studio, Will was reunited with Stretch, backstage at the Rachel Willis show. Will gave Stretch a hug around his neck, and as many pats on the side as his arms could manage. Will, Stretch, Mom, and Dad all stood in the large, mostly empty room, watching Rachel cook with some bald chef Will had never heard of. A commercial break covered the freshly roasted carrots Rachel had just garnished, and all of a sudden, the empty room came alive. People rushed through, pushing pieces of set, carrying furniture, moving racks from one side of the room to the other. It was like an ant farm was accidentally knocked off the shelf, and now all the contained chaos within was unleashed. Will felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around to see Rachel Willis, the lady he'd seen on his TV every cold and flu that he'd ever remembered having. "Hi, Will," Rachel said excitedly. "I'm so happy to see you and Stretch. We're so glad you were able to make it." She seemed genuinely happy about it, too. Not fake like most adults who, when they meet a new 13-year-old for the first time. She continued, "Can I take a quick picture?" Yeah, sure." Rachel nudged Will a bit closer to Stretch, and then put her arm around the boy. She pointed towards a woman with a huge camera who seemed to appear out of thin air. The photographer gave an obligatory "say cheese." Stretch, Will, and Rachel all grinned, and the picture was quickly taken. "Thank you so much," Rachel said, taking a step away from Will and Stretch. "I'll see you out there in just a minute." Their entire interaction lasted maybe 20 seconds, but Will felt like it went well. Rachel had a way of making him feel welcome and important. I guess that's why they pay her the big bucks, as Dad would say. Before they knew it, a man in a tan baseball cap with headphones approached them. "You ready?" the man asked in a gruff, hurried voice. "Yes," replied Will. "Good, head on out there." The man pointed towards the curtains right in front of them. Will and Stretch began walking forward. Will could hear the applause on the other side of the velvet veil. Stretch could hear it too. He began to get excited. A little too excited. Stretch ran forward through the curtains as the electronic sounds of pre-recorded circus music played by a big band over the massive speakers overhead. Stretch made it about halfway through the curtain before his back hoof got tangled. The blue drapery acted like reins, preventing Stretch from moving forward any further. Stretch began to jump, attempting to free his leg. Will felt a shot of worry, coated with the shell of embarrassment, pass through his system. Then he heard laughter, louder than the applause that had cued their entrance. Will turned his attention to the TV, where they had watched the cooking segment. What he saw made him burst into laughter. Stretch, only halfway revealed, looked even more unusual than normal. The giraffe head and neck poking out of the curtains, clearly connected to a horse-sized front half of his body. Clearly connected to a horse-sized front half of his body. The rest of his body was hidden, making it look like he was some strange two-legged creature standing upright. As he hopped up and down like a rebounding basketball player tricked by the bounce, he stuck his tongue out, a la Michael Jordan. The crowd loved it. After a couple seconds of jumping, Stretch decided accelerating forward was the best way out of this textile trap. He began running. In a moment, there was a loud tearing sound, and the entire curtain came down, draping over his horse-like giraffe body. Sporting his new gown, Stretch began the performance, filling up his cheeks with air and crossing his eyes. The crowd went wild. After a couple more faces and even louder laughter, Rachel made her way over to Stretch, gave him a pat on the neck, and announced, "Stretch the laugh draft, everybody!" Cheers joined the laughter-filled air. "We'll be right back." Will ran up to Rachel. "I'm so sorry he got stuck," and Will started to explain what happened. Rachel brushed it off with a wave of her hand. "Don't worry about it. That was the best segment we've had in years." Rachel gave Stretch another firm pat and tousled Will's hair and walked off toward a lady who was holding a clipboard. The show must go on. The Powells and Stretch were all transported back to their hotel, which had a lovely outdoor area for Stretch. Wow, Will thought. They really think of everything when you work in show business. The family went up to their room, but Will could see through the window that Stretch was happy as a clam, leaning over the fence and smiling at pedestrians and cars passing by the hotel. After spending the night in the fanciest hotel any of the Powells had ever stayed in, it was time to go back to reality and return to Logan, Utah. As they started climbing into the black SUV parked on the curb, Will noticed Stretch was also getting loaded into his transportation, about 100 yards behind them. He also noticed that Stretch was making a high-pitched whining noise. Will hopped out of the SUV and ran back to Stretch's truck. The crew getting Stretch in the truck were just as professional as the crew back home. Everything seemed fine. There was a fruit salad and water in the back of the truck just waiting to be devoured by the tiny giraffe. The men were handling him with care, but Stretch was wearing an exaggerated frown and whining. Will ran to his side and gave him a hug. "Stretch, it's okay, buddy," Will gently reassured Stretch. "They're just going to take you home. I'll meet you there, okay?" Stretch understood nothing. Same as every other time the boy had grunted and made mouth sounds at him. He just didn't feel right. His face showed exactly that. Although he was protesting, he dutifully entered the back of the truck and laid down on the metal floor. Wherever they took him next, he was hoping he'd be able to stay there for a while. When the Powells arrived home, the shimmer of showbiz whirlwind that they had been swept up in faded quickly. Their home was familiar and plain, nothing like the room where they had just spent the previous night. Stretch hadn't arrived yet. It turns out, driving from New York City to Logan took a lot longer than flying. Who knew? It was almost like the Powells had briefly returned to their pre-Stretch life. Collectively, they all realized just how dull and colorless their past life had been. They hadn't even opened the first piece of luggage to start unpacking when Dad's phone rang. He answered, still in a bit of a daze from processing the insanity of the last couple days. For the first time in a week, Dad opened up his email inbox. Among the spam, newsletters he didn't remember signing up for, and ads for blue pills, he saw a message from someone named Jackson Terrace. It wasn't a name that caught his eye, it was the subject line. Booking for late night with Jason Balson. Jason Balson, the biggest late night host in the nation. This was starting to get out of hand. Chapter 16. Dad replied to the email, and before Stretch had even made it back to Logan, the booker from Jason Balson had arranged for a new crew to pick up the giraffe and transport him to Los Angeles. Skipping school to travel coast to coast and perform on television with your pet giraffe was a dream come true for Will. A dream he could have never imagined or articulated just a few months ago. But now that it was happening, this was clearly the coolest thing that could ever happen to a 13-year-old. The following day, Stretch arrived home and made his way out of the back of the large diesel-powered metal box, only to find himself being ushered into another metal box. This new box was a few feet longer than the first and had more grated windows, allowing fresh air to circulate more freely. The giraffe glumly accepted its fate and moved without incident from the old traveling crate to the new one. The floor of his new digs were covered in straw and blankets, making it a bit more comfortable than the last mode of transportation. He also found a bucket of fresh fruit, pineapples, oranges, and strawberries, waiting for him in the back corner. If he was going to be shuttled around the country, at least they were going to feed him well. The Powells, having had a couple of days at home before this new trip snuck up on them, waved goodbye to Stretch through the metal grating and climbed into another black, nondescript vehicle headed toward the airport. The entire human side of the family, Mom, Dad, and Will, were unsure on where this entire venture was heading. Were they just going to keep getting more gigs? Was cross-country travel going to become the norm? They also all had individual concerns. Mom wondered if she would need to officially pull Will out of school and start homeschooling him. She was horrible at math, biology, chemistry, pretty much every STEM subject they focused on in school. Maybe between her and Will's father, they'd be able to produce a functional adult by the time Will turned 18. Dad wondered how long this streak of good luck was going to last. He had been able to use fall break, sick days, and paid time off to accommodate the trips and performances over the last few weeks, but he couldn't avoid work forever. Well, if the performances kept coming and the family was getting compensated for the act, maybe he could. Was there such a thing as a giraffe agent? He could be the first one. How would that look on his resume when he eventually tried to return to higher education? Will wondered if life was going to stay this exciting. He had turned 13, become a teenager, and all of a sudden his life was full of opportunities and fun. Did everyone experience something similar? Obviously, not every family had a giraffe, but maybe every teenager suddenly picked up a new skill or learned some secret that they used to finally start life. The tutorial was over, and now real life was beginning, and real life was amazing. Similar to when the family arrived in New York, the family was taken to the airport from the airport directly to their hotel and given a short time to settle in. After unpacking and testing each bed in the room with a quick jumping session, the new vehicle arrived to pick them up and take them to the studio where they met Jason Balson. Jason was shorter than Will expected, but he had a sharp jawline that seemed to cut the shape of his profile out from his surroundings. Oddly enough, he always seemed to be turned to the side, so aware of his angles that he never took life head on. It seemed to be working for him. The studio was much bigger and busier than Rachel's. As the family stood backstage, Stretch walked up behind them. Will whirled around and gave the giraffe a big hug. "Stretch!" he yelled. "I'm so happy to see you. Isn't this amazing?" Stretch moved his head back and forth, both taking in the surroundings and indicating he didn't agree. Will continued firmly patting Stretch's side as they watched the first guest sit across the desk from Jason. The first guest was even more visually striking than Jason. Gustavo Fioriso, soccer player from Mexico who had traveled the world playing for every top-level club in every top-level league. Real Madrid, AC Milan, Juventus, Chelsea. His resume read like a top 10 list. The interview was particularly interesting. Jason was hanging on every crisp word Gustavo let slip past his lips. Gustavo was calm and spoke slow, measured authority that sounded like impromptu poetry. Everyone in the room was watching with rapt attention. Suddenly, a commercial break. The entire backstage area had been quiet and slow while Gustavo playfully recounted the time his son scored a goal in a friendly one-on-one backyard exhibition. Now the entire studio buzzed and erupted in motion. Will and Stretch were walked out on stage by a woman in a headset who was quickly reciting rules to Will about what he was supposed to do. The instructions didn't go in one ear and out the other. They didn't even penetrate. Will barely registered her voice, and he and Stretch abruptly stopped moving at a small X of tape on the floor. "Good luck," she said, after she had already turned around and started walking away from the duo. For the first time in a performance, Will felt very nervous. Before every performance, had felt like he and Stretch were just hanging out and making faces in the backyard. This felt different. His palms began to sweat. He could feel sweat starting to collect near his left ear. If he stayed under these stage lights much longer, he'd be completely soaked in sweat or melt into a large flesh-colored puddle. Will turned to look at Stretch for comfort, but he found none. Stretch's head was hanging low, just above Will's head. The giraffe was staring straight ahead with a gloomy, bored look. He sighed. Will turned his gaze forward, and he sighed too. Showtime. The commercial break ended, and Jason, still at the desk about 20 feet away from Will and Stretch, wrapped up his shallow personal conversation with Gustavo and turned towards the camera. Welcome back. We have a very special comedy duo tonight here to perform for the very first time on late night television. They are the hottest act in the country, rising faster than Willy Wonka's elevator. The crowd gave a small chuckle. Give it up for Stretch, the Laugh Giraffe. The light on the camera in front of Will lit up. It was time to shine. Will nervously looked up at Stretch, who slowly turned around to face away from the camera. Nervous laughter came from the crowd. Will felt like he was baking right there in front of a couple hundred set of eyes. What was Stretch doing? After completing his 180, Stretch bent over, put his head under his legs. Quickly he whipped his head up, peeking out from underneath his tiny horse-like body. He made a loud vuvuzela-like noise and started flicking his tongue up and down. The crowd loved it. Laughter exploded toward the stage. Stretch pushed his head further through his legs, causing him to lose balance and do a somersault forward. The laughter was even louder. Finishing his rotation, he turned back to face the crowd, sitting on his backside like a dog, and crossed his eyes. The applause was deafening. The camera cut to Jason over at the desk. He was wiping tears from his blue eyes. Just out of frame, Gustavo stood up and held out his hands, palm facing the audience. Stretch stood back up, prepared to do the bean when Gustavo started speaking. The camera focused on his tan face. Wait. Everyone waited. I don't understand. Is this supposed to be funny? The audience began to murmur. The laughter quickly turned to a low hum as everyone in the studio seats started looking at one another, trying to make up their minds. Were they going to take Stretch's side or Gustavo's? Jason quickly gained his composure and tried to take control of the situation. Amicably, he spoke to Gustavo, using the camera as a proxy. Well, he started, I mean, you don't see a giraffe act like that every day. Gustavo quickly replied, Does that make this giraffe funny? Jason's face changed from a fake Hollywood smile to something much more uncomfortable. He began to look like a child who'd been scolded by their parents. I'm not sure. Then Jason remembered there was a show actively going on right in front of him. I guess we can find out how you really feel after the break. Whatever illusion Will had been living in for the last couple of weeks broke. Once the commercial started, Will quickly walked Stretch backstage. Will could tell that Stretch was shaken by what had happened. He walked the giraffe to the quietest corner he could find backstage and started stroking the giraffe's hanging head. With tears in his own eyes, Will began whispering to Stretch that he had done a great job, no matter what anybody else said. Will was putting on a brave face and working hard to focus on comforting Stretch, but it was clear he was the one who needed support. Seeing her son cry and hug Stretch was too much for Will's mom. She bent down and gave him a big hug. It's okay, honey, she said. They just don't understand how special Stretch is. Will's dad joined the hug. It'll be okay, Will. Next time Stretch performs, everyone's going to love it. I don't want Stretch to perform anymore, Will said, choking on his embarrassment. Let's just go home. Chapter 17. For the rest of their short time in Los Angeles, Will felt numb. He was silent on the drive back to the hotel. He wasn't able to eat dinner. He didn't sleep a wink. He refused to eat breakfast. He stared straight ahead on the flight back home. The entire time, he could only think about how sad Stretch must have felt. A few days after the Powells arrived back home, Stretch arrived, and Will walked him into the family's backyard. Will sat down next to Stretch's food and water buckets, while Stretch slowly ate his first familiar meal in over a week. Quartered Granny Smith apples never tasted so sweet. Life isn't generous enough to provide time to grieve, even when you are embarrassed on a national television by the world's greatest soccer player. The day after Stretch arrived, Will went back to school. As he walked the halls with his overstuffed backpack, he had a familiar experience of students pointing and laughing as he walked by. He was, once again, being ignored by every teacher. The adults were trying to be responsible and not bring up Will's traumatic experience. It somehow made things feel worse. His middle school experience was now reminiscent of when he first arrived in Logan, except now he also felt like he betrayed his best friend, Stretch, in addition to being simultaneously both invisible and unliked. Sonny seemed to be feeling the sadness sloughing off of Will's aura. The boys would still sit together at their same lunch table every day, but now they sat mostly in silence, eating their soggy beige food and beautiful homemade Korean dishes respectfully. The friends no longer rushed back to the Powell home after the final bell rang. Instead, Will would slowly drag himself alone while Sonny caught the bus back to his own home. Everything felt gray. The few weeks of monotonous, dreadful days passed with an unbroken routine of school, home, sitting sadly outside with Stretch, sleep, repeat. Stretch seemed to be in low spirits too. He would spend all day laying near his food and water, eating and drinking only what he needed, and staring off into the distance. No more watching the neighbors over the fence, no more sprinting the length of the yard. Finally, one day, as Will arrived home, Mom was talking to someone on the phone. Will noticed she had a hopeful smile on her face and was repeatedly brushing tears from her eyes. She noticed Will approaching and quickly wiped both eyes, smiling directly at him. "Okay, I'll let him know. Thank you." "What's going on?" "William?" Mom started, letting the tears start to fall. "That was a man from the city." "From the city? Logan City?" "Yes," she said, sniffing. "He said they have gotten hundreds of phone calls from people all over the country asking if they could have our address. They want to come see you and Stretch perform." Chapter 18. Will's dad was a good dad, not only because he worked hard and provided for the family, not just because he taught Will lessons about life and helped him work out issues that came up, not only because he loved Will endlessly. He also would go to any length to make his son happy. He had adopted a giraffe, for God's sakes. Now it was time to build his son and that giraffe a stage. The night Will and Mom told Dad about Mom's call with the city, the backyard became a construction zone. Dad used the last of his PTO to stay home and work all day measuring, cutting, hammering, screwing, building a wooden stage large enough for Will and Stretch. Will would come home from school every day and work alongside his dad, gathering tools and keeping Stretch occupied, while Dad did all the heavy construction. After finishing the stage, Dad and Will went back to the home improvement store to gather lights, curtains, and everything necessary to turn the stage into an environment fit for a world-class draft and boy show. Will used paint and a large canvas sheet to create a sign, which he hung from their fence. The sign said, "World Famous Laugh Giraffe, Saturday nights at 7." Once the stage was built and the sign was hung, Will called the city back. He told the man who delivered the news of the callers from around the country that the city could now give their home address to anyone who asked. They were ready to receive and entertain anyone who wanted to see the giraffe Gustavo hated. The crowd started to come. At first, the shows were small, just a couple of families from Logan and the surrounding farm towns. Stretch and Will would walk up on stage, welcome the small crowd, and make faces side by side to the delight of everyone in the backyard theater. Soon, the crowds got larger. Every week, the backyard was getting more and more full. The Powells would spend the Saturday afternoon setting out blankets and lawn chairs and any other makeshift seating they could to try and make sure everyone who came to see the show was comfortable. No matter the weather, no matter the temperature, Every Saturday night, there was a crowd of a few hundred locals and tourists quietly watching the magic of face-stretching Giraffe and the happiest teenager on earth. Chapter 19. Will had been so immersed in telling the story of how he and Stretch had met and built this crazy show that thousands had come to see, he almost forgot where he was. Again, standing on this familiar stage in his backyard, he looked over at his partner Stretch. The quiet, somber crowd remained silent as tears began to fall from Will's eyes. A few days before this final show, Will's dad had performed Stretch's routine checkup. Stretch hadn't had a clean bill of health the entire time that he had lived with the Powells. That's why the zoo had allowed him to go with the Powells in the first place. But things had taken a turn for the worse. Heartbroken, Dad had informed Will that Stretch wasn't going to be able to perform any longer. In fact, Dad said it would be shocking if the draft lived more than a month longer. Will could tell. He just hadn't wanted to believe it. The duo had performed every Saturday night for nearly 6 months. Stretch was brilliant, but he had started slowing down a few months back. For the last couple months, Stretch had performed entirely while sitting in his dog-like pose. Last week, he performed their final show completely laying down, tired. Only a few days after that calm performance, Stretch was gone. Having finished telling the audience the story of his best friend, Will looked over at the small Stretch statue that sat in his partner's usual position. Will wiped his tears and walked over to the copper effigy. He knelt down and touched his head to its cool metallic body. Kneeling there, leaning on the statue donated by a local student, Will began to laugh. Even during the saddest on-stage experience he'd ever had, the absurdity of it all tickled him. Stretch really was the greatest comedian ever to come out of Cache County. That was Laugh Giraffe, written by Cameron Rogowski, me, and read by me in a single sitting. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this book or you enjoy any of my books, please like this video, subscribe to the channel. There's more books to come. Thanks.